Good morning and welcome to the 2021 Cannabis Policy Summit hosted by the Cannabis Patient Advocacy Association. My name is Rita Montoya and I'm your MC for today. As jurisdictions across the world continue to establish public access cannabis markets, the state of Maryland, like many others, has continued to grapple with the development of an adult use cannabis market despite decriminalization of small amounts for possession and the establishment of a medical market in 2014. Today, we have an esteemed panel of professionals, including Hope Wiseman, Ashley Wynn Grimes, Simone Kaysen, David Hernandez, Chelsea Higgs-Wise, Kevin Johnson, Roz McCarthy, Tom Degonia, Bernice Miracle North, Perry Paler, and myself here today to help educate you about some important considerations in the establishment of adult use cannabis markets. And so without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker for today, Hope Wiseman. Hope Wiseman is the CEO of Marion Maine. She is an entrepreneur, a business strategist, and cannabis industry trailblazer. At the age of 25, Hope established Marion Maine in her hometown of Prince George's County, Maryland, as the youngest Black female cannabis dispensary owner in the United States. Today, she will discuss cannabis equity in a post-COVID era. Welcome, Hope.
Thank you, Rita. Good morning, everybody. I'm very, very happy to be here and share a little bit about my story, my experience, what it's like as an operator. And as we are at the point in Maryland that we are developing policy, I think it's extremely important to actually speak to the people that are in it right now. You know, there's already a medical industry that is shaping what will be the adult use industry as well. So I'm excited to share some insights with you. And of course, I'm available to anyone that wants to talk further and dive deeper into the experience of an operator, especially a Black operator in this space. So for those of you who don't know me, like Rita said, I have been kind of deemed as the youngest African-American woman to own a dispensary in the space. And that's very exciting. But I think when people hear that, we don't consider all of what it took to get here. So I want to just tell you a little bit about my story, and then I'll get into kind of what is happening now. I began pursuing the industry in 2014. At that time, Maryland had passed a medical use bill, but had not yet had an application process and actually began the industry in the space. So I was part of the first round of licensees, and it was a very difficult process. So for someone interested in owning a business in this space, they must go through a very, very strenuous application process. It's extremely competitive. Every state is completely different, but previously Maryland's application process was one where you did have to identify property. You did have to go through and have plans on how the property would be laid out. You had to have a full out security plan. You had to have a full out operations plan. You had to have a diversity plan. You had to have a community engagement plan. You had to have all of these pieces of your business already put together while you went to go apply for it. For some people, this could be costly. Some people had to hire subject matter experts to get this information out. And some people were able to bootstrap the process together. Either way, it's a very strenuous process for entrepreneurs to go through. And it is increasingly more difficult for entrepreneurs that may have been previously affected by the war on drugs, because they are competing in a pool of applicants that are extremely well capitalized, and have a level of experience because of how they've been able to capitalize their company that is hard to compete with. So I wanted to shed light to that as we're developing legislation around this space. And if we want it to be truly equitable, we have to provide resources for people who may not have the financial means to compete in that type of process to still be successful. And that could mean tiered licensing. That could mean to have a certain set of licenses put aside for certain groups. For instance, in Massachusetts right now, Delivery licenses are only for people who qualify for social equity status. The same thing is happening in the city of Los Angeles. For 5 years, delivery licenses are only going to those who fit social equity status. So we can see that there is a way to provide opportunities for those who have been impacted by the war on drugs or are part of these marginalized demographics. So currently, I want to talk a little bit about how COVID has affected the cannabis industry. As we saw in every state, pretty much in every state, cannabis was deemed an essential business. This was really, really positive for the cannabis industry and showed the nation's willingness to accept this industry. And now we see that businesses have accelerated much quicker than they planned because of it. So a lot of businesses are up over 100% from last year or from 2019 and are still experiencing growth even into 2021 and going into 2022 based off of the boost that they got during COVID. So yes, the industry did have to shift. Yes, we did have to figure out how to remain safe during that time, and there were a lot of laws enacted all over the country to allow for safer practices. For instance, in Maryland, we allowed for curbside use. That was not in place before COVID, and has been something that the state has kept in place even now. Now that we are kind of entering the downside of the virus. And I think that is really positive for the industry. It has grown it from an economic perspective, allowing curbside, allowing delivery in places where it was not previously allowed. These things have accelerated the growth of the industry, and at this point, it's not turning back. So that's really exciting for entrepreneurs that want to get into a space. It's allowing for more opportunity as delivery companies, third-party delivery companies are popping up around the state. And there's just so many different ways to be involved. So my next point is to get on to just that, how you can be involved in the industry and how we have to make sure to address these points when we're writing legislation. So ancillary businesses are businesses that are not necessarily plant touching, like myself, a dispensary or a cultivator or a processor or manufacturer, but somebody who provides a service to plant touching businesses. And a lot of times these businesses are ignored when legislation is being developed. And it's something that I believe we have to look at also including in bills, because it is a part of making sure the industry is actually equitable. So as Maryland approaches adult use legalization, how can we ensure that minority-owned businesses have a place in this industry, and not just from a plant-touching perspective? Just like we see in other processes that the government mandates, they will have set-asides for minority-owned groups and women-owned groups. And I believe that needs to happen in Maryland as well. So that's just one way that we can ensure that this industry is equitable. But I want to talk about what that really means, equitable, because I think most of the time when you hear that word, people are only talking about how it applies to businesses, and how it applies to, okay, minorities, Black, brown people need to be included in the industry. They need to get dispensaries. They need to get cultivation centers and processing centers. And although I do believe that, I think that we're missing a big part of what social equity really means. I think we need to address criminal justice reform first and foremost when we're talking about true equity in the space. People cannot be involved and benefit from it if they are still being affected by a previous conviction or just by a residual effect of their communities being disenfranchised. So that being said, there's hundreds of millions of tax dollars being generated by legal industries. And in the cannabis industry, it's very important that we understand exactly where the tax revenue is going, and who it's benefiting. So, and a lot of times we'll say, okay, tax revenue has to go towards education, but there's nobody tracking that. There's no one making and enforcing it. And there's not a lot of transparency. And in cannabis, we need transparency. The war on drugs was long and dirty, and it was not transparent. And we demand true equity this time. It starts with criminal justice reform. We're going to talk a little bit later on today or this morning about how, although arrests have gone down dramatically, the trend of still favoring minorities in that space is still there, which is disheartening. And it just goes to show how much reform is still needed, regardless of the fact that numbers have dropped due to even medical legalization. Furthermore, we're going to talk a little bit about myself, and some of my other colleagues are going to talk a little bit more about expungement and the importance of it. And not only just expungement, but releasing. There are people today, right now, in jail in Maryland for what I do every day. So those people need to be released. Their records need to be expunged. They need to be able to have resources to enter into the industry, and or just to enter back into society in general. But I think that if we think first about criminal justice reform and then go into social equity and making sure that the actual industry itself has ownership of these marginalized groups, I think then we're on the right track to actually having a truly equitable industry. So as we discuss policy throughout the morning, we cannot forget that cannabis is a medicine. So I would like to introduce the next speaker, Ashley Wynn Grimes from Cannabis Nursing Solutions and author of Asa's Medicine, to discuss cannabis as medicine. Thanks, Ashley.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Hello. My name is Ashley. I really appreciate Hope's talk. That was amazing. But we're going to talk about cannabis as medicine, just so we can kind of get these concepts pulled together. So when we're hearing these topics like expungement, equity, reform, we have in the back of our mind that cannabis is medicine. So let me pull up my slides here. Okay, I won't be pulling up slides here. So I will talk through them. I don't have my images. My computer is actually blocking my slides to come up. But my name is Ashley. I go by endocannabinoid specialty nurse. And I wanted to talk more about what cannabis medicine is by breaking down the concept of what cannabis medicine means. So first, medicine is a compound or preparation that is used for the treatment or prevention of disease. Especially when we're talking about drugs or a drug or drugs that are taken by mouth. So an example of those drugs are things like Dilaudid. We're talking about oxycodone, Xanax, things of that nature. They all fall on the scheduling chart. Cannabis happens to be a Schedule 1 drug, along with heroin or fentanyl. The thing of it is all medicine has side effects, and really what we're talking about here is relating it back to how severe the side effects can be and whether or not it does have medicinal value or not. When it's on the Schedule 1 status, it actually means that it has no medicinal value. But that science is saying time and time again, as we get more and more research, we're finding out that it has more medicinal value than originally thought. So when we talk about compounds in the plant, what are we referring to, right? So in the plant itself, it has cannabinoids and terpenes, and I'm going to start with just speaking of those two things. But within the cannabinoid category, we have phytocannabinoids and endocannabinoids. Endocannabinoids are the cannabinoids that are naturally produced within the body, right? Phytocannabinoids are the cannabinoids that are produced naturally within the plant. And a lot of the research is showing is that THC, which is a phytocannabinoid, almost mimics one of the endocannabinoids within the body. So there are over 100 phytocannabinoids. A lot of people don't realize it. Based on like the general media and all those kind of things, we hear CBD, we hear THC, but we don't talk about the CBGs and the CBNs throughout the plant, and they all play a part in how it interacts with the body. And then there are terpenes. Terpenes, there are over 200 terpenes, so let's start with that. But there are some that we know more about, and then some we don't know less about. And the same is true about our cannabinoids, which is why we tend to focus on that CBD and THC. But so an example of a terpene is limonene, which is also found in lemons, like literally found in lemons. You can ingest limonene in your tea. You ingest limonene in any seafood. You squirt a little bit of lemon on it, and it's refreshing. It's a mood booster. It makes you feel good, right? That is also found in cannabis. Another example of this is beta carotene. Beta carotene is found in black pepper, right? So you're always ingesting beta carotene, and it also plays a part in inflammation, right? It reduces inflammation. So those are just a few examples. We have pinene that's found in the pines. We have linalool found in lavender. So, and we all know that lavender is a relaxing scent. Why? Because it has that linalool in it. So, those are just a few examples of how terpenes can interact with the body. But let's talk about more the endocannabinoid system. So first we talk about the compounds, right? The compounds are what make it medicine to begin with, based on the definition that I started this conversation off with. And now the endocannabinoid system is the largest receptor system within our body. We don't talk about it often. Comparable to the cardiac system, comparable to the respiratory system, the gastrointestinal system. We have the endocannabinoid system. And we don't know everything about this system, but we know that it has receptors throughout the body and not just in the brain, contrary to popular belief. So a lot of people feel as though THC only affects or only has that psychoactive effect. That's not true. It can have psychoactive effect, and that's also dependent on how you consume it. But it also affects different parts of the body. So based on where these receptors are located. So we have CB1 receptors and we have CB2 receptors. Those are located in the CB1 receptors are located mostly in the central nervous system, and play a role in memory and pain and all those kind of things. And then the CB2 receptors affect the pain and inflammation and GI response and those kind of things. And all of the cannabinoids have the potential to bind to these receptors. And then there are also other receptors in the body that aren't necessarily directly related to the endocannabinoid system, but also play a part in how it affects the body. So an example of that is called the 5-HT receptor. I'm not going to break down all the details because I know it's a little complicated, but SSRI drugs bind to this receptor the same way that CBD does. So an SSRI is like a Prozac or a Lexapro, all those antidepressant pills that we're familiar with. They both can and have the potential to bind to that same receptor and affect feelings of anxiety, depression, addiction, appetite, sleep, and pain. Again, we need more research. A lot of it is going on as we speak, but I think the floodgates will be open when we transition out of that Schedule 1 status, where we're saying that there is no medicinal value. And then beyond that, again, this is a very complicated system, but there are enzymes that break it down. There's fatty acids and all these things that play a part in how this endocannabinoid system works. All in all, if you didn't understand nothing that I just said, please know this. We generally, when we're talking to patients about how cannabis, the whole flower, interacts with the body, we generally like to have all aspects of the plant considered when choosing the plant. And we call this the entourage effect, because all of the different compounds work synergistically or work together as a team to affect the body and contribute to the overall effect of the plant. And I mean, of the overall effect in the body. And a lot of times we like to isolate these compounds and say we want only CBD isolate, or we're going to take out this THC, or we don't consider all the other cannabinoids. And really, when we're looking at this plant as the medicine that it is, it works together naturally. We don't need to do a whole lot with it. But so another piece of this part of the pie that I like to consider is the duration and onset of the different methods of consumption. A lot of times we like to vilify inhalation, but it does have its place. All methods of consumption have its pros and cons, and they all need to be considered when choosing your medicine. Inhalation can be valuable because of the quick onset and the predictability of its onset and how long it's going to last within the body. On the contrary, ingestion has the longest onset and is most unpredictable and can actually have a higher psychoactive effect if not used properly. It is very, and because of that long duration time, a lot of times people are under the impression that they need to take more and more and more because they didn't get the effects as soon as they wanted to or anticipated. So the duration time can be from 30 minutes to 3 hours, and that's a big window of time to be waiting for, some relief from whatever your symptoms are. The other piece of it is topicals are a very good modality for skin treatment, and it doesn't go into the bloodstream. So those are just a few considerations when choosing your method of consumption, and it plays a huge part in what and how you choose to use the plant in connection with all of those compounds and how they interact with the endocannabinoid system. So I won't go too deep into it, but in conclusion, there are no real differences in medical cannabis versus recreational cannabis in regard to how it relates to the body. So we tend to talk about medical cannabis and recreational cannabis as if it is two separate things, and it's not. It's just cannabis. It's just how do we create the rules around it and who has access to this medicine and why are they choosing it is what we need to consider. And then my second point is when patients choose to consume, they should be fully aware of what and why they choose it because it is a patient-driven medication. So generally, when we talk about medicine, doctors and nurses, we are the ones telling you to do it, when to do it, how to do it, all those kind of things. And this is not the case with this medicine. So it is more important in this realm that patients are more informed about how to use it intentionally and on with purpose. And then the third thing, which might not be applicable here, but it sits near and dear to my heart, is that healthcare professionals have the right to be informed about the complexities of cannabis medicine and need to participate in the decisions that affect their patients. So with that being said, I'm sorry my slides weren't here. I'm sorry I didn't have any pictures for you all. I hope that I gave you a good description of what I was trying to convey to you. Thank you very much. But I would like to introduce the next panel. It's called Curating Legalization, Perspectives on Adult Use Cannabis Markets in Michigan, New York, and Virginia. Thank you again. My name is Ashley from Cannabis Nursing Solutions. All right, I'll talk to you all back later.
Good afternoon. Thank you for being here this afternoon for Curating Legalization: Perspectives on Adult Use Cannabis Markets in Michigan, New York, and Virginia. Today, I'm very excited to be joined by three amazing panelists: Chelsea Higgs-Wise from Marijuana Justice, Simone Kaysen from Cannabis Capital, and David Hernandez from Happy Monkey. Thank you for being here. Today, we're going to talk to you about what it takes to get to an adult use, quote unquote, legal market, the social equity considerations, and what we need to do to make sure that folks from Black, Indigenous, and Latinx communities are getting access and entry to these business opportunities. So if you could please all introduce yourselves, tell me a little bit about how you came to work in this space and what you do.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Rita. I'll go first. My name is Chelsea Higgs-Wise, and I am the co-founder and executive director of Marijuana Justice right here in Virginia. I started out as a social worker right here in Virginia, growing up here, and really switched to advocacy and organizing with my community around 2015, particularly when we started to see police violence on TV and in the media. And in 2019, we realized a way that we can really demand a liberation and freedom for our people, a repair for our communities, and reinvestment is for an equitable legalization process. So really excited to be here and talk about our wins in Virginia.
Thank you. And Simone?
Hi, everyone. How's everybody doing? My name is Simone Kaysen. I am the CEO of Cannabis Capital, which is an insurance agency. We cover everything from seed to sale, everything in between. And then we also have a sister company, Cannabis Capital Securities, which will be a one of the first local stock exchanges in Michigan. So we're looking forward to being able to do that, and that launching in March, and it will be centered around racial equity businesses raising capital. So that's my baby. And then I also own Cannabis Capital Holdings, which is all marijuana real estate. So I'm in that space. I sit on the board of directors for the MRA Social Equity Board. And so our job is to task our initiatives that the state will be able to adopt to access entry points for racial equity businesses in the green space. So that's what I do.
Thank you for being here. And David?
Thank you for having me. My name is David Hernandez. I currently am Happy Monkey's Chief Operating Officer. I usually say COO. Got tripped up on that one. We're based up in New York, and we're New York's largest and most known cannabis lifestyle brand. We're known for our experiential events, media platform, and just honestly, just the Happy Monkey tribe that is just really just vibrant up in New York. But before doing that, I actually got my cannabis start down in Maryland. I'm a Goucher alum. I lived in Baltimore for 6 years, and I'm a caregiver in Maryland, a licensed caregiver, and a licensed patient in Maryland as well. And I was also an I-71 compliant vendor for 3 years down in DC. So I've seen a lot of different phases down in the DMV. And currently, I was actually featured in New York Mag when it went legal, because I used to go up to Albany every weekend and yell at Cuomo before it was cool. So that's what I'm known for. Yeah.
Thank you all for being here. So let's talk about the work done in your respective states, because we now know that in Virginia, Michigan, and New York, all three states have adult use cannabis markets, and some are in different stages than the others. And so let's talk about, tell me about the work that you've done in your state. What did it take to get there? Chelsea?
Thank you so much for that question. So I mentioned that we really got into this game about 2 years ago, and that is when Virginia had a Democratic House, Senate, as well as the administration. And we just really saw this as an opportunity. And that was in 2019 going into our 2020 session. Our sessions are usually from January to March. And we could see the landscape that wasn't quite ready for a full adult legalization use. Many people were still talking about decrim. So in that moment, we proposed a study that really was able to look at an equitable legalization and what people had done across the country, what people had done well and not done well. And that was in early 2020. And then now at the end of 2020, and we remember what everything happened in 2020, right, from COVID to the uprisings. By November of 2020, that's when Virginia announced that we would be looking towards legalization. And so Marijuana Justice has really been looking and following the language as well as the actual proposals within the legalization bill. That's over 500 pages here in Virginia. So we're really looking at the repeal model, which is all Virginia has done at this point. What is actually legal in Virginia is adult use and possession up to 1 ounce. Our legal markets are set to open in 2024. Our next General Assembly session, which starts in 2022, January, is really where we're going to be finalizing everything that we missed last year. We had a big celebration, had a historic win as the first state in the South to legalize this. But the truth is, here in Virginia, we reenacted much of the language around criminal justice, around the repair, and definitely around where the tax cannabis revenue will go, as well as the licensing structures. So when people are asking me questions about what this will look like, I'm telling them very directly that we're going back into session in January to tighten a lot of this up. So that's where we are right now in our process. We were really excited to say that we sealed records and passed a very large expungement process, with marijuana being a caveat, and really important to talk about that with any state that's legalizing. How are you expunging and sealing records, particularly there? We fought really hard for an automatic expungement process. And we worked with Code of America for that. We always want to drop that name, that this is an automatic is possible. We want to tell that the automatic is possible. You don't have to go petition based for these expungements, y'all. It will cost people money. It is a barrier, right? Something else that we left on the table, we were passing that expungement, but because of the automatic, and I'm sure it's in Maryland too, is you're going to have to wait for a lot of these DOC records. So what we are here to do is talk about the people that were left behind, talk about the folks that are impacted, literally pull the records and say their names. Do they need to be expunged? Do they need to be resentenced? Virginia did no resentencing. In fact, across the country, there is not one state, y'all, not one state that has actually implemented the resentencing for those that are incarcerated for marijuana and cannabis. That is a shame. We have passed some laws in a very few states, but we have yet to see the implementation really happening, to even see the data on if it's successful. So that is something else that we're going into 2022, and something to really keep in mind for Maryland to think about as you are legalizing these markets, of how are we including those that are still incarcerated, because we need them out to be included, right? We need to understand who they are. And we need to make sure that, unfortunately, here in Virginia, I just talked to somebody that right now they're still in jail and prison for something that is a civil penalty right now, but because it was charged as a intent to distribute, they are left behind. They're still serving 9 years, right? So these are conversations that we have to talk about and understand who else we're leaving behind as we're legalizing. And it's taking Virginia a couple years because we did not prioritize that in the committee meetings during legalization process, and something I'm really encouraging Maryland to do and to think about. And then when we talk about that and why it's important for the markets, is because unfortunately that time in the committee is value, right? So the only thing we passed is a way for the cannabis market to collect profit. That is important. That is really important to set up that regulation in that market. But what I'm telling everyone is make sure the time is equitable for the criminal justice portions as well, because we left everyone behind in our first round when we're talking about this, and you don't want the same thing to happen in Maryland. But something that we did have a really great win with is not just that top tier for licensing, but a micro business structure for smaller businesses, and being able to even offer some co-op language that we're going to revisit as well. And this part is when we're really diving into what does social equity mean? Who is going to get these revenues? We also developed a cannabis equity reinvestment fund, much like Illinois. And so this fund is going to collect 30% off top, and it's supposed to go to people that were impacted. So how is Maryland setting that up to really be equitable? That is money for folks that are set aside, and is not going to be something that, as we set up a market, is going to be in the competitive, right? Or something that we're arguing about in committee. And I think it's really important as folks talk about legislative processes, if you aren't hearing us talk about people incarcerated, resentencing, expungement, and we're only talking about markets, of who we are leaving behind in these markets that we're creating. So that is my soapbox. I can talk much more about the licensing processes here in Virginia as well, but I really wanted to start off about like who we're centering and making sure that even in our process of legislation, how we're thinking.
No, those are all really important points. And I think at the end of the day, it all boils down to what you said is, what does social equity mean? Right? When we're talking about this, that's a really great start to allow for minimal amounts of use and possession, because that's really what 1 ounce is, right? That's not that much. But where are we going from there? And are we passing this before we've even had these conversations, before we've even asked these questions, before we've even allowed all of the people in the room that need to be there? Right?
And
Who are we leaving behind? And, in Maryland, we know that even though the numbers are very much down in terms of arrests for marijuana possession, arrests for even with distribution, the trends are still the same. It's still overwhelmingly Black people.
And to be very honest, that's exactly why you see Virginia legalizing possession now and not a legal market until 2024. They wanted to wait to legalize it until 2024 as well. But we actually FOIA'd the data, even at a decriminalization level, like you said, the numbers went down, but the actual desperate enforcement was still there and actually had gone up. So with that information in the legislator space, we were actually able to now release that relief, like of that enforcement, that policing, that surveillance of this now, right? And that's really important to us to get that off of us now as we talk about the legalization process.
And I think we've seen some of that in New York as well, right, David? I mean, that's one thing that, yes, there's a lot of things to be still ironed out. Can you speak a little bit more about that process, and kind of what the impact has been in the immediate and what you're hoping to see?
For sure. Something that I really want to applaud New York on, and I hope that Maryland and other states coming online really takes, I guess, advantage of like New York's model, in the sense that we can smoke cannabis or consume cannabis anywhere you can consume tobacco, right? Which doesn't sound that, crazy or just different. But when you look at all the other states that have legalized, and like when we're talking about policing and what has led to this kind of like, it getting legalized, but there's still being, a focus on Black bodies that they want to be imprisoned. That's really, that social consumption and public consumption is really what they were hitting people with tickets for in DC when it went legal a couple years back. And so the fact that New York allowed you to do that, we're in a weird space. We're kind of very similar to that like Initiative 71 space that DC is still kind of stuck in. You can't buy cannabis and you can't sell it, but you could grow it in your home, sleep like a baby with 5 pounds in your crib, and have 3 ounces on your person, and you could give it to whoever you'd like, as well as smoking anywhere you could smoke tobacco. So it is simultaneously one of the most liberal and like forward moving cannabis laws, but at the same time, it was done in a place where the same day we got cannabis legalized, Governor Cuomo also legalized gambling from your phone, right? So it was very much a smokescreen from a lot of the things that was going on up in Albany, also pressured by what was happening, Virginia, New Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and we were seeing the money leaving the state. And I feel like, as much as I wish it was like a champion of good that led to us legalizing back in March, it very much, was very much forced and trying to kind of push the later news that came down, I guess, a few months away. And so I'm hopeful right now, especially now we got 2 cannabis commissionary people chosen, Chris Alexander and Tremaine Wright. Really, really awesome advocates and people of the culture and people of like just the New York cannabis scene, and just understanding politically as well as culturally what's going on here. And I feel like New York right now is poised to kind of set an example for the rest of the country that, social equity and even just legacy to legal transition is something that's going to have to be not just talked about or discussed, but actually put on the forefront. And the company I work with, Happy Monkeys, a big believer in that transition, in the fact that, we came out of that legacy space. We came out of that space as legacy operators in delivery and social consumption. We had a cannabis nightclub before it was legal. And we invited politicians to our space to kind of see what safe consumption looked like. To have a nightclub in Times Square, New York City, 5,000 square feet, and 3 years, not a single fight or argument, which New York nightlife can't really say once alcohol is present. And so we were really just setting that example and being advocates by practice. And I feel like New York has really set a tone that I hope states like Maryland follow.
And what about you, Simone? Michigan's been established relative to the market for quite some time. Have you guys seen these impacts in more of a long-term fashion in terms of the effects on arrest rates or business entry? What does social equity look like in Michigan?
Well, I mean, I think that's a good question. First of all, I'm tired of the word social equity, right? Because I think it's become this buzzword that we've, that we use over and over again, but it's a buzzword that hasn't gotten it right. Right. There's no initiative that has really gotten it right. And I think a couple of those things are because of, I think there's a couple things that we have to look at. And I think it's the three pillars that we've all discussed over and over again. It's going to be the expungement, the education, and then also the entry as access to capital, right? So I like better of an idea when we talk about social equity, because that means ownership. But I also would like us to entertain the word social economics, right? Which kind of develops and looks at how someone's culture, education, all of those things lead to their money, right? And how they deal with money. So when we look at it in Michigan is a different baby. And I want to tell you this because we were one of the first states to go medical in 2008. So as a whole, we have more medical card holders than any other state, right? In the United States. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that we went into inception in, I believe it was 2019 when we passed Prop 1, which is adult use. So we have a full market. Each one of what you need to know in Maryland is that, and even New York and everything else, it takes about 24 months for you to be able to really get into a real market. So we have a toddler, right? We got somebody that knows how to say no. Yes, mommy, daddy. We have a real market, and it takes about that time. And that's because you're looking at legislation, ordinances, different municipalities functioning in. And so all of those things. So we're in full bloom at this point. In addition to that, the state of Michigan did not put a cap on the amount of licenses that are available. So when I segue, I tell all of this to say, now that we're segueing back, what we're seeing is we've already incepted a clean slate program, just as you guys have. So it will be automatically dismissal at 2023, any of your convictions or whatever. And that's not just marijuana. That's a certain amount of convictions or whatever that can be removed. But that's very expensive for the state. Y'all have to understand that. That is an expensive thing. So I don't know, if that is in the language, it's great. Making sure that there is a pathway for access for that. In addition to that, for all of our indigenous people, our Hispanics, Mexican, Black, what we have to understand is that just because someone says it's social equity, that doesn't give you a bypass on business. Business is still going to be business. I sit on the board with the CEO of the Canadian Stock Exchange, and let me tell you something. The same thing that the big boys are doing, the multi-state operators are consolidating. They're buying and selling and acquiring each other. What do you think they will do with you? So we have to have a level of education on how business is being done. In addition to that, we also have to create provisions for access to capital. Social equity discounts do not mean a welfare check for you to sell weed. It doesn't happen like that. So you have to be able to create pathways that are tangible, meaning joint ventures programs, which if they are not predatory are a great opportunity, where a large MSO can be able to partner with someone who has a pulse in the community. In addition to that, they're able to use their knowledge. What you have to understand is now that the dope man, guess what? You now have a viable trade. Okay, so you have to be able to leverage that and leverage it with some good sense. And then last but not least, making sure that you're persistent. Go ahead.
Let's talk about that. So what you just said, because there are millions of small businesses across America in various industries, right? And small, big, huge. You have to have a viable business plan. You have to have the investment or capital that you need to run whatever you need to run per monthly. How many employees do you have? Do you have to pay benefits? All those things. Right. And none of that goes away just because you're operating in cannabis. And as we
and it becomes even bigger.
Right. There's a cannabis tax even.
Yeah.
And so when we talk about folks from underserved communities, folks from historically excluded communities, because that's really what we're talking about. We've been excluded from these spaces. What types of programs or what types of obligations should the governments who are creating these adult use legal markets have to undertake to make sure that people who look like all of us have access to the same thing, even though I can't go do a family and friends raise for $500,000.
Okay, great. So I think we have to understand, I think that's the definition of insanity, to ask for the same thing over and over again and never and expecting a different result. I've been African American my entire life, right? And so what I do know about bureaucracy and government is that in most cases what they do is they keep us on a plantation, meaning that you give funds to the weaker amount and do not make accesses for our middle class. Have y'all noticed that there are absolutely no provisions for middle class people? That is done by design. You give it to the runt, you give it to the weaker class, and you make these provisions, but never create a serious pathway to create generational wealth. That has to be done by us. Now we have to understand that it's the government's job to create the party. It's our job to invite the people. All right. So what that means is as many pathways and initiatives that they make, we have to be able to create pathways that will be utilized by our own people. That was one of the reasons why I came up with the local stock exchange, because I understood that the government was not going to give $1 million to Black and brown people for them to sell weed. But because of God and Google, we can create a pathway that we can create a local stock exchange that individuals would not only be able to reinvest in racial equity zones, but also for them to be able to raise capital. And so that's what those things are going to be looking like. The second thing is that our committee came up with the joint ventures program. Now we hear about joint ventures programs all the time in different industries, healthcare, automobile. One of our biggest people that we actually have is Bridgewater Interior, where they make all of the seats and the face thing, the rearview mirrors for Chrysler, Tesla, and a host of other ones. That was where a minority business actually teamed up with a major entity. What we need to understand is there is no shortage of investors in cannabis. There are a shortage of viable businesses. So if you are willing to pay $100 or whatever for your hair and your nails, I need you to pay $300 an hour for an attorney to be able to look at this relationship that you're building. So when we talk about these predatory contracts, we have to actually educate ourselves on how business is being done. This is the legalized dope game. It ain't for the weak.
But wouldn't, when we're talking about, because this is the term that the government does use, is social equity, right? A lot of these markets, that's what they're talking about, providing social equity. And so with what they're establishing, and by and large, what we see is education programs on how to get into the industry, or maybe small grants, or as you call them, like social equity discounts, right?
Yeah, they're usually discounts.
And so, they're basically not going far enough, right? They're providing a little bit and saying, okay, see, we did it.
So if you believe something else or you waiting on them to give you something, I think that that's a great narrative. It sounds like a lot of excuses, but we don't have a lot of time. Right? Before we know it, this market will be shrunk. We don't have the time to wait for them. Of course, no state has gotten it right. We want them to get it right, but we have to continue to move forward to get into these spaces, or it will be too late. The whole industry will be Walmartized. So there are initiatives that we could do, and I think everyone is piggybacking on everyone else, but we have yet to get past that.
So
Something I want to,
go ahead, David.
Something I want to touch on too is, so when we look at communities coming online and underserved communities, and like the opportunity for these people to be entrepreneurs in the cannabis space, just the idea that from bud tender to CEO and corporate C-suite, those structures exist in the legacy market. Maybe not with the same jargon and same, nomenclature and everything like that we want to associate to corporate cannabis. But when we talk about these communities, these are people who have been running businesses. The same kind of grit it takes to get 1,000 pounds of cannabis from California to New York City is, there's a lot of infrastructure and corporate know-how that needs to go into that is not really seen in the boardroom level. And that's something that I think New York is kind of poising itself to attempt to do right. Social equity applicants, one, need to own at least 51% of the company, and they can't sell or buy out. There's a moratorium for 3 years. So as a lot of these other states, which do have pilot programs and joint programs that kind of prop up people in the business who've owned restaurants or things like that, maybe not just who have business acumen, to then strip away their licenses. New York is kind of poising in a way that is kind of giving legacy operators a space to kind of come into that space of seeing, the work that they've been putting in, whether it be decades or whatever it may be, actually has a transition to this new space, and not just to be a bud tender, not just to be, some kind of concierge at a dispensary, but actually, from C-suite to bud tender. And so I think that's something that I also want to keep focus on too, because it's not just people who've run a few businesses or just want to be entrepreneurs. They're people who are doing it day in and day out and have been feeding their family for generations off of that work.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point, especially when we're talking about, that transition and what types of programs should we be providing to ease that transition or to even allow that transition to happen. Because we know that in some spaces it's not happening at all, right? Based on the requirements or the things you can have or not have. And so, everyone talked a little bit about expungement and the importance of that, but, let's talk about workforce development. We hear that's another kind of industry, regulatory term that we hear about, right? But is that enough? Is it enough to say, okay, well, we're going to train you how to be a bud tender and, maybe you'll be the general manager one day or the inventory manager or something. But if we're not getting access to the C-suite, whether it's through our own companies or being hired into somebody else's company, is that enough? Has the government gone far enough? What do you think, Chelsea?
Yeah, no, I really appreciate both comments from David and Simone on this piece, particularly because I think that what we're hearing is that the government is never going to give us everything that we deserve. And it is also important to make as much space as we possibly can, yes, and to work with folks doing that on both. This is how Black folks organize, right? And how we really should be thinking together, right? And to do this. And I think that to your question, Rita, is it far enough? We have not seen anyone go far enough. David, I'm going to tell on ourselves a little bit and also give New York a lot of props, is that we learned a lot from New York. And so we also have the 5 year of you not being able to sell for social equity. They are going to have, we do have an incubator for money for these social equity operators, which is not going to be enough, but it is there. And we're going to be able, because it's there, we're able to continue to advocate for more money, right? And if it wasn't there, then there'd be no chance. So this is the type of access that we saw happening in New York, and it was like, wow, we want to model. I also just want to bring back that space of the clean air, where it's called the Clean Air Act here, of wherever you can smoke cigarettes. We were saying we should be able to also smoke and consume cannabis. We do not have that, and our Virginia legislators are just really denying that. But that's something that I want to tell Maryland you have to do for folks with public housing. You have to do for those with unsheltered. This is something we have to start nationally for that conversation. But back to our topic of, is it far enough? To actually talk about the workforce, to actually make spaces for folks that maybe not necessarily have a record from this legacy piece, but what is your role? And that, to find out what that role is in your state. I think it's really important here, and I'm trying to also educate myself and cultivate from this legacy to legal conversation here in Virginia and how to put that forward. But my answer is no, it's not enough. And we have to continue to push for money for operators, for money outside and private industries, how we're organizing with that to make sense with legislation, right? Because if it's not workable, it just doesn't make sense. But the workforce, the micro businesses is a piece that we also put that's really important language for a different tier of entry, and all allowing that to graduate, right? So that was something that we saw in New Jersey, of being able from a micro license to go to a regular license. And that's really important to that tier and be able to move. And also, I really love what Simone said about the no caps on the licensing. That's an equity move as well. And here in Virginia, we got all types of caps, went right to ABC. So again, so when you're asking me, is that enough? I'm looking at the bill altogether, not just that social equity component, which I also heard Simone talk about. I hate social equity terms. I like
okay, right.
This is. I was like, I want to hear. I want a whole equitable bill. I want all of these pages to be equitable. So if it doesn't make sense in every part about it, and I'm a holistic person, so if it doesn't make sense and I have a question for David too. I would love to hear this, but if the expungement law is only for people with misdemeanors, Virginia, and your social equity language says you have to be eligible for expungement, Virginia, So how are you bringing in people with felony records and those folks that were probably really know what they're doing, the runners, the CEO, the C-suites of the legacy market? How are you even making space for them in, right? So, but you would have they didn't even catch that in the original piece because they were only looking at the social equity pieces and not the criminal justice pieces to bring it all together. And this is how we get lost in the social equity language. I've talked to too many national advocates, y'all, that you tell me you don't read the criminal justice sections of the bill. And I'm really disappointed in it, but I would also love to support folks on learning that language in case you're just an entrepreneur, you just want to learn it, but it's going to be important that we see that all together. And that's how I answer the question, is it enough? Right? It's the whole piece.
You made it a really important point. And, you know, if we have a section here that says only misdemeanors are eligible for expungement, and then the business entry section says you have to be eligible for expungement, and you were kind and you said they must not have realized, you know,
well,
I'm an attorney by training.
Yeah.
And I know a lot of attorneys and people who are legally trained in that way, and it's really hard to not realize things. And so I would actually, you know, are they not realizing, or are these sometimes maybe designed, right? Because you're
absolutely
not
sorry.
you're not
I'm just
bringing in that
wondering really quickly,
right?
because we have to understand most people don't read, period. Let's just be honest, right? I mean, we can play games and we can go back and forth in semantics, but I'm a very realistic person. Most people do not read. In addition to that, most people do not understand, even I'm talking about even senators and state representatives. A lot of them don't even understand the language behind a lot of the way, because the bills, because there is a major difference between will and shall. Yeah, and when you're dealing with this language, so it becomes really big in semantics. So that's a big thing. In addition to that, a lot of us have to understand that, again, it is our job to be able to push these legislations to go through. We are the citizens, so being able to get them supported and a host of other things. Last but not least, you have to understand that most of the people that are making the decisions are state workers, which means that they make about $50,000 a year. If they work 40 hours or 80 hours a week, they get the same amount of money. So all of those things, it is important for us to push these initiatives. Just like David was saying, that Happy Monkey wanted to become a display of what it could possibly look like. We're entrepreneurs, we're dreamers. Most state representatives are not. They're bureaucrats. They're looking at things the way that they are. And I think when you understand how policy and business works, that then you can be able to have a stronger conversation. Last but not least, one of the things that we did for fair market, which was really, really important for us, that we're looking to do, one of the things for me was creating fair wages. And what I understood is, if you get a barber's license, right, regardless of whatever, if you go to any Supercuts in the world, you're going to get $20, right? So we wanted to adapt the same narrative as Illinois did, meaning that if you touch the plant, then you take so many hours. We're not talking about your whole life or whatever. You take so many hours. Couple things that does. It takes the training responsibility off of the employer, which we're seeing a whole lot of stuff going on right now in our market because they're making them sign non-competes and all this other stuff. It's just a big old thing. But in addition to that, we can create fair market wages so that whether you're Black, brown, or whomever, there is a fair market wage for you in this industry. And I think that that's very, very important.
Something I want to touch on too that I think is like really important to this discussion, like just the fact this is going to politicians, or at least politicians' aides, and I appreciate whoever's like listening to this and actually giving the time to expand your mindset around this topic, because that's something I saw in New York. We invited politicians to our space, like very much had to have the discussions of like, they're not cops, they're not feds. Politicians need to see this. And I saw people who directly put their like pen to the bill, Crystal Peoples-Stokes, Axel Barnaby, and these type of people who champion what happened back here in March, see and come to Happy Monkey and tell me to my face, I didn't know people still consumed flower cannabis. I just thought they only vaped. I didn't know where people did this. Like, where do people in public housing smoke? Wait, they come here because they can't smoke in public housing? I didn't know. Wait, billionaires come here because they can't smoke in their co-op buildings because of the board? they didn't understand those kind of things. They had to see it. And so I don't want to make it a dichotomy, us versus them, because we need, one, we don't want politicians to not like, you know, the advocates on this call, but we also want you guys to learn and understand we have a wealth of knowledge that you guys don't. And you guys have that actionable power. We just want to give you all the intel and things like that to make it possible. So not that there's a dichotomy between the culture and corporate, or culture and government, or whatever it may be, but that you guys are the ones pushing the needles forward. And it's okay not to know. I feel like politicians very much have this thing that we know everything, we're the all being, you know, like absolute, just because that's the way it's propped up to be. But it's okay to be vulnerable, and it's okay to ask community leaders like us, and just have, you know, not know that people like smoking 4 grams in one joint. You know what I mean? Like, to some people that might sound, sorry, go for it.
No, I just wanted to say that, to the question of did they know, or did they do that on purpose? Like, just a little bit of process, which is what folks are saying, like, to know the process. In Virginia, you give briefs, then legislative services writes it up in all the detail, and then they kick it back to you. And so if they're not, and then when I said this to legislators about that particular piece about misdemeanors and being able to be eligible, it actually took people like, oh my God, I did not read this and connect it, because I read them in silos, right? And they actually took it out of committee and said, we got to talk about this next year. This doesn't make sense. This isn't ready. And so it actually, I would rather them fix it then, but again, I'm glad that you didn't pass it in that way. So it isn't really, and they're very honest with you behind closed doors. And this is the relationship that David's talking about, to create of, we can be the folks to help you and bring you up to speed and answer these questions for you. And they were very honest to just say, I did not realize that was happening. When we decrimmed, and we actually made it harsher for youth, we told them after it passed, and many people were like, oh my God, I had no idea we did this. And so it really is important to know, like, the process of some things are absolutely intentional, I think, but also just the way that the process works. There are going to be players and stakeholders that we can bring along with us and educate, and because they got so many. We have part-time legislators. They literally only work January through March, y'all. Not full time.
But that's a lot of states.
Yeah.
That's a lot of states. And so you have to understand that. But also in that, with that legislation, we also have to be very, very mindful that every state is different. Every state and not only that, almost the municipalities are different, right? So I mean, when you're making this big bubble of legislation, but as I said before, if you go to most states, legislation it's a continuous document, right? So it doesn't stop on the 23rd. There are going to be new things that pop up that are going to be culturally distinct to that state and to that area. Things that work in Michigan might not work in Maryland. We've seen it over and over again, where different states have adopted different nuances from other states, and it didn't work. Right? So as it evolves and as the market starts to become its own, one thing that I would say to the legislation is making sure that they create, like our state, they created a board of individuals that were from minorities, right? And so that was able to give feedback on what that looks like. Right, on what that looks like, and how they're being impacted and infected. To your point, it is not good for them to make solely these decisions on an industry that they have no footprint in, right? Just doesn't make sense. And that would be any industry, so I think that's imperative. One of the good things in Michigan is creating that board. I think we started out, it was 20 of us that we did a whole year of initiatives, and now we have a continuous board that we stay on, that anything that goes on that is by the MRA, or especially in our racial equity, we have a footprint and a say-so on what goes on.
And really just really important point by all of you, that a couple things. We have to manage our expectations, right? As advocates, as community members, that, our legislators in most states are part-time. They're not being paid nearly for the amount of work that they do. They're constantly
overworked
every single day. And also, we think about the number of topics and bills and pieces of legislation and meetings and events and things that they're going to, again, every single day. It is really important to have leaders like everyone we have on this panel here today to be available to educate our policymakers, whether they're elected officials, community leaders, regulatory staff, state
Mhm.
staff, and to make ourselves available in that way. So, thank you for just really showing how important that is. I think all of you, and really said the same point that we have to be here, and
It's
we have
us.
to remind them that that's
Mhm.
an open invitation. Right?
Mhm.
We're here to help you understand this industry that is new for everyone, in terms of its regulatory, development, but especially to a lot of our legislators who may not have any personal experience with cannabis, or who may only have scary experiences, right? Maybe
The
you knew people in your
stigma.
community, right?
They
Your
only
community.
have the stigma. And I know from a Black woman, y'all, growing up in a Christian church, oh, that's the devil's sticky ick. Like they don't even have this mindset. But then as they get older and baby boomers, they're realizing, hey, cancer, that it can have assistance on all of these different conditions. And so that's why I'm saying it is important for us as citizens to not just wait on the government. The government has their part, don't get me wrong, but we got our part too, to push the narrative, push the initiative, and educate on what this business and what this plant can really do. That's a very important part on both of our sides.
And something I kind of want to like jump on the back of that is, so there are three pillars to this. There's, government, the culture, and then there's also corporate cannabis. And I feel like I also want to kind of like sound the whistle in the sense that we're talking about people getting into this space, and we don't, there's a legacy operation, and there's corporate cannabis. Legacy cannabis, I think Forefront Ventures, or New Frontier Ventures said it was $60 billion a year in the legacy market, 20 billion in the corporate cannabis market, with 38 states online. If government officials keep giving the hat to corporate cannabis and forgetting the people who are actually holding this entire industry up, it's just going to create that dichotomy. Legacy operators are not going to stop because Curaleaf opened up in their state. It's just not going to happen. And so there has to be ways that people who are doing it already feel comfortable in those rooms, because they're not going to stop doing it. And it's just going to become a re-policing. And then you're just going to start sending the feds to stop people because they're fucking with Curaleaf's money, or I don't know if I'm allowed to curse or whatever, but essentially just really putting your brain around the fact that it's not a big battle of who's going to win, but understanding that all of them kind of like the rising tide rises all boats, and the people who are doing it need to be a part of that win too, because if not, it's just going to be another race at the bottom, and we're going to be here in 10 years having a very similar call,
Exactly. It's really important that I think everyone realizes this is an ecosystem.
I'm good.
Right. And if this ecosystem does not work in harmony, then we have more problems than we came to the table with, right? We have a real opportunity as a country, as separate jurisdictions, whether you're in state, municipalities, counties, to ride this economic boom, but not if then monies are basically being reallocated to public safety issues or policing, or now incarceration, because we're incarcerating a whole different group of people because of, distribution, right? We have laws protecting corporate cannabis, whatever level of licensing you may be, mom and pop to the large MSOs, but we don't have we still have laws that, we're still catching people for distribution, right? It's a fine line between possession and distribution in a lot of states. I was a former public defender, and what we count as paraphernalia, what we count as personal use versus distribution. Are your ACE individually packaged? Well, now you might be a distributor. Is it packaged in your 1 ounce, right? What does that look like? Those are all tiny little details that in a court of law make a big difference, and in someone's life make a huge difference, right?
Even looking at state lines, even looking at state lines, like I live in Maryland, and I'll probably say, like, I not proudly say, but I got in trouble in Maryland with cannabis and got caught with a couple pounds of weed, got hit with a few charges that luckily through, good lawyering and just where Maryland's laws are, I'm able to kind of work around and live my life. And luckily it's not impacting me the other ways it has. But if I got that same situation in Manhattan right now, I would be completely fine having 5 pounds in my house. So it's just understanding that, like, even just the way jurisdictions and lines are drawn, as someone who travels all around the country, like for my job, really understanding that the mindset isn't like Simone was saying, it is really state by state, it is municipality by municipality, and just understanding, talking to many people, knowing that the life that you live and the life that maybe the people around you live is not really what works for 1 million people, or a state with 18 million people, or a country with 350 million. So just like really perspective is huge.
the perspective is who, and then one thing I would like for everybody to know is that we have to convince Chelsea and David, we have to convince everyone that there is profit. And I'm not just talking about money, I'm just profit in diversity, period. That's just period, right? So not even just as a financial person that we say don't put all of our eggs in our basket, but as we've all said, and I think that this needs to be very, very clear, that we got to sing the same note, the state, the corporations, and the community, right? And so at that point, we all can create a profitable platform, not just for the lack of being arrest records, for being able to push narratives with social equity businesses, and not only that, but being able to be profitable as corporations. So those three are the stakeholders, and we have to be able to get to the point where everyone understands what a win looks like for each of them. And a win for one does not mean a loss for the other one, that we can all win at the same time.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
I know we are definitely talking about a lot of how to create these legal markets. And just before we get off the call, there's a couple technical things I really just want to bring up for folks that are looking at bill language or how to create these things really well. Number one, make sure you have someone that's willing to read that over and over with each amendment, each substitution, because this language is so important. As Simone said, that may and shall will change your whole life. And what we have seen and what we learned from Illinois, and when a lot of people learned in watching Illinois not have not one African-American dispensary, was this social equity piece that they said it was a component. And it says that an operator, all they had to do was hire 10% of impacted people as employees, and then they would qualify for this social equity criteria qualifier, and now be able to be a social equity operator. What we saw then is now in Illinois, they have no Black social equity, nobody. And that was something that was also presented in Virginia. And we had to fight and actually bring in people from Illinois to say how it screwed them. Mm-hmm. And that's when our legislators, again, were like, oh, dang, we didn't even realize. Mm-hmm. But because somebody put that in there, right? So, but it wasn't them, and the legislators you got to help them and read that. So that's number one. David brought up the point that I had too, of making sure that understanding the legacy market is here. And so the very minimum that we can do is look at how we are continuing to enforce marijuana even after legalization, and to make sure we're not just locking folks up while they create their space at the table with this new way that we're doing cannabis. And then, start talking about, some states do lotteries, some people don't. Like, there's our boards so let's start looking at these different ways of how licensees are chosen, looking at the different tiers. We talked about that before, of micro business, one major tier that's very expensive. There's these micro licenses or different classifications, looking at that, right? That's how we have this diversity within the market as well. And, I also just want to say that as folks are having conversations about where the tax revenues go, right? Like in your state and in your localities, because localities will be able to collect that tax revenue. We are in here as not necessarily entrepreneurs, as we are really grassroots folks, for folks of the most vulnerable. We are really saying that with those tax revenues, we should look at how to invest those directly into people that have convictions, directly into people that have been disenfranchised with the collateral consequences. Mm-hmm. And what we've seen and modeling up with advocates in Illinois is this guaranteed income model. So with tax revenue, why not create your equity fund, like many states are doing now, and create a way that takes a guaranteed income project that we loved in 2020, right? Mm-hmm. Everyone loved it. And put it towards putting money directly in people's pockets right now that were impacted. This is a reparations model. This is a new way of thinking. Simone, you said we all got to have the same language. So when people are asking what to do with that tax revenue, it's important to start making ways for direct transfers into people's pockets with that money as a reparative justice, because not everyone's going to get a license. Not everyone wants one.
And everybody shouldn't have one. And not everybody should have one. But, and then just to piggyback on one of the things that I think is really, really important is that Illinois, as much as we love Illinois, and as I was saying, how your legislation has to be a living, working document, it is a great example of a great idea that went bad. Right, so it was written by the Black Women's Caucus. Give it up to my girls. They wrote this 600-page body of work, but it did not culturally fit the business model that the state had. I'm from Chicago. I'm a Chicagoan. That's where I'm gonna be. You know what I mean? But at the end of the day, so as we see this, every state is going to be different. And so you can have this great idea, right? But if we don't get the information to the people and it does not adapt what's cultural, because what works in New York won't work in California. What works in Denver won't work in Michigan, and whatever. So it's a continuous body of work. 2024 is not the end of your work. That's when y'all just getting started, right? Because at that point, you're going to see what the market actually looks like. You can't, there's no data analysis for it. I'm sorry. I've seen every state screw up. And it's because it just takes time to figure out what that market is going to evolve into.
Really great point, Simone, that, we need to consider these regulations, whatever the bill XYZ is that actually technically creates it, that this is an ongoing process. This is not a one-stop thing and okay, now we're good. We don't have to deal with that cannabis business anymore.
No.
Right? I've seen that in other spaces that in other states that I've lived in where, or especially early on when it was still very much more stigmatized and criminalized, of legislation being passed and then nobody wanted to get involved. And then it just devolved into a mess, right? And so it's really important that we hope that our legislators and our community understands that this is not, we get to the finish line and then we're done. Getting the legislation in place is getting us to the start line, right?
That's the easy part. It's the part when they become legalized, and it's like watching y'all. It's honestly like watching a kid grow up. It really is. You have it in its infancy stage, and then he grows up in 2 years, they're a teenager. You're really watching this market grow in every state, and it takes on a personality of its own.
As a mother, I can definitely resonate with that. As when you're pregnant, you think like, oh, this is so challenging, and oh, that's just the beginning. That's not even the half of it, right?
It's not even,
and
once you start getting these licenses,
they change depending on the circumstances and what's going on, and you have to adapt, and you have to be willing to be flexible, and you have to be willing to admit that sometimes you just don't know. So,
and admit that you messed up.
Yeah.
We screwed this one up. Let's try again. The legislature has to be able to say, we didn't get this one right, and not be afraid to go back to the drawing board. Again, David travels all over. David, you can attest. Every state that y'all go to, the market is different.
Wildly different, like literally. Especially when you're up on you're in the East Coast and you can travel a couple minutes and be in another state. You know what I mean? Like it's insanely different. I've been out to the mitten, you know what I mean? Even medical reciprocity. I have a medical card in 6 states right now. And there's states I've had to get medical cards in just so I could get, the medical benefits in, because they wouldn't take New York, Maryland, New Jersey, Connecticut, like all these other states I have. And so it's just wildly different. And so something I do want to just say really quickly, because we're talking about legislators, something I think New York did right was that we codified in the law a lot of things that, right now you can gift weed and you can have 5 pounds in the house and grow 6 plants and these kind of things, and social consumption and delivery are in the codified bill. Amending a law and fixing that or putting guardrails around that once it's codified is a lot easier than having to go back and try and re-ratify and push something through the House. Crystal Peoples-Stokes took over 12 years, I think, since she announced that bill, and it really was pushed through a stroke of just the universe letting it happen when it did. But if social consumption wasn't there, if delivery wasn't there, smoking, anywhere you can do tobacco, those things are pillars because it's codified, and people understand once something is codified, it's not going away. It's not being amended away. There's going to be a huge fight. In the same way, the reverse is the same. If it's not in the bill, Maryland, if you guys don't do it, you guys don't do your homework right now, this conversation is not going to end, and it's not something that you can amend away or push to the next session. It's going to detrimentally affect millions of people's lives.
And that's why I want to just jump in. That's why we followed New York, because cannabis advocates said no to a bad bill for a very long time as well. And that's the kind of bravery we have to be to say that there are certain things not in this bill, then we should not be passing it, and why we have to be able to push the right things. And before the legal markets happen, there is a lot of hard work to be done to say, no, we shouldn't be collecting no profit off of this until we've at least found a way to stop criminalizing people.
I think that's a really, really great point, because one of the things that I've often lamented about the Maryland medical market, as David knows, is that there is no dedicated, social equity or diversity, equity and inclusion or justice, or however we want to term it, officer, right? There is no diversity officer. And we've all seen the problems that have plagued Maryland in terms of access to entry, in terms of business licenses. We have challenges for people who want to become medical patients, people who are still getting pulled over and things like that. And we have no dedicated person paying attention to these issues. And now we're primed to create this adult use market. And, are we going to go back as well and create that position or that office in the medical market? How do we solve these challenges? And I think that, we can't rely on this idea of being able to go back and just say, well, we'll take the crumbs because we just want this so bad.
Right.
It's okay. We're going to, well, I'm sure they'll do it eventually. Well, they still haven't done it. And how many years out are we in Maryland for the medical market? Right. So we all have to be collectively brave and say,
Yes.
we are not going to accept
Mm-hmm.
bad legislation. We're not going to accept legislation that is not equitable for our communities, that is not just for our communities. And so let me ask you then, what would be, let's create a wish list, right? The holidays are coming up. What do you want for December holidays? What's your December holiday wish for a legal market? What's the top consideration?
My top consideration would be for each state, legalized or not legalized, because at the end of the day, this is one thing that we know. No 10-year-old that or younger that we know will ever know life without marijuana, right? We know that, right? So we just know that it was not like when we grew up as kids, oh, marijuana was bad. Everybody will know marijuana. So I think at this point, we're approaching maybe in the next 2 to 5 years legalization. I think my ask would be for them for it to be a continued conversation with the states and the communities on how to be able to right this wrong of disproportionate arrest, education, and being able to have abilities to access money. Again, as we talk about social equity, it becomes about our social and our cultural norms with money. And so we're going to be less likely than our counterparts to have the access to capital. But how do we get a chance in this new financial revolution that we are in, right? We are in a financial revolution where we have access to capital, God and Google, social media, all these different avenues to be able to access money. How do we create creative narratives for us to be able to realistically get into this market as in employees, employers, and create a generational wealth?
David, what's your wish?
My wish, and I focus this on New York and just the East Coast and everywhere I go. I really, really want to see space made for the legacy market, and not in the sense of like, oh, let's just give these people licenses so we can prop them up to fail, but they're actually being structured pathways for people who are doing the business well to feel comfortable in these spaces around people that they either know more how to do business than, or just as business acclimated as, and just that actually not be a point of contention, and there really be an intentional and thoughtful ways to bring in this community, to not just create venues for the money to leave the community, but actually ways for it to be reinvested in the community for the people who are doing it to whether they want to or not. If you've been selling weed for 60 years and you don't want to sell weed legally, you should also have that option, and you should still not see your livelihood and your family's livelihood leave your community. And so making space, being intentional, and for the policymakers to just understand we're people too. We're not social equity applicants. We're not legacy operators. We're people first, just like you are. And so just that perspective and understanding that the people you're legislating for, that they're not just a marginalized group that needs help. They've been doing just fine, not just fine, but they've been surviving, and they're not looking for your handout. They're looking to build an industry just as big as alcohol was when it started after Prohibition. This is life-changing stuff, generational wealth generating kind of stuff. And we need to look at it that way. be tactful and know that these conversations a century from now are going to be just as important as the ones Anheuser-Busch was having. So, yeah.
And how about you, Chelsea? What's your wish?
Yeah, I want to lift up what they both said, particularly about the access to capital and then the inclusion of the legacy market without forcing them into a legal market that just continues to criminalize them. And with the idea of evaluation written into your policy and a way to pay for the evaluation of how your market is going, how you all are still criminalizing people. And with that data, that is how you can come back and create better policy and better markets. So as you are legalizing this to create an evaluation process and put money towards data, right? Ask the right questions in this evaluation for your community, right? And that, I believe that would be the last thing I would want to add. And I can go into more technical stuff about caps and social equity licenses and what that looks like. But that would be my really main ask. And then as here in Virginia, I just had to do this little plug, we're having a conference December 2nd through the 4th about all things cannabis in Virginia. And that's when we'll be hearing more about what is our top ask with legacy for more folks in Virginia that have been doing this work.
Thank you so much. And, we talk a lot about Virginia because it's right next door to Maryland. And I think that anyone who's been to this area knows you could be driving and pass through DC, Maryland, and Virginia all on the same trip and maybe not even realize it. So it is really important that we look whether it's next door or even just, a few doors down, to our neighbors to see what everyone's doing, while also recognizing that we are our own state, we are our own jurisdiction, we are our own communities. So thank you to all of you for coming to our community and being part of our community. We have today with us Simone Casson from Canis Capital, Chelsea Higgs-Wise from Marijuana Justice, David Hernandez from Happy Monkey, and I am Rita Montoya from the Cannabis Patient Advocacy Association. We're grateful to all of you to be here, and thank you all for tuning in.
Everyone, thank you for joining us today for the Fireside Chat Say Yes to Expungement here at the 2021 Cannabis Policy Summit presented by the Cannabis Patient Advocacy Association. Today, I'm joined by Rita Montoya and Hope Wiseman, and we'll be discussing the importance of expungement, the cannabis arrest trends here in Maryland, and the need for industry opportunities for formerly incarcerated communities. Just by way of introduction, Rita Montoya is an attorney, policy strategist, and lifelong advocate for underserved communities. She's an attorney by training with a demonstrated commitment to and a career in public service, providing business, compliance, education, legal, and corporate social responsibility platform services catered to small and family-owned businesses in and out of the cannabis industry. Hope Wiseman, very famously at the age of 25, became the youngest Black woman dispensary owner in the country. Her dispensary, Marion Maine, opened their doors to Prince George's County, Maryland, with a purpose of serving and educating their patients about cannabis. Her continued mission has been to end the stigma in this country surrounding cannabis within the Black community and helping her community realize the importance of their place in the cannabis industry. She's done this through community education, expungement, and reentry advocacy efforts, and much, much more. I'll be moderating this conversation. My name is Kevin Johnson. I am the Director of Creative Marketing for Peak Relief, a dispensary in Rockville, Maryland, and very much also very focused on our community advocacy efforts. So thank you both for joining us, and thank you to everyone that is watching.
Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you so much, Kevin.
Definitely. Just so by way of introing this, I thought it would be apt to use a quote that I saw in the Sun. Costing $3 billion annually, cannabis prohibition racks up over 500,000 arrests annually, with more than 90% for simple possession. Beyond adding to the perils of our country's very shameful mass incarceration, the impact on communities of color is dramatically disproportionate. Black people are 4 times more likely to face these criminal charges for possession than their white counterparts whose consumption is equal. A very tragic reality with lasting consequences for marginalized communities. So I think by way of that background, I wanted to start the conversation off with understanding expungement, shielding, and sealing services. And one of the quotes that I saw from the Maryland District Court Chief Judge said that we're at a point that we've done everything that we can do technologically, and it's going to require a manual intervention for anything else that's needed. So my question would be, what should the priority be from some of those services, expungement, shielding, and sealing? And what do you feel is the most advantageous route for some of these justice impacted communities? And either one of you could start.
Yeah, I think, in terms of legally, it might be that each case and each person's background has to be assessed in a different way because the legal mechanisms just are what they are. Sometimes expungement's going to work, sometimes shielding will apply. We're talking about charges that for some people are making millions of dollars. We look at these numbers again, we see, yes, it's great that the numbers are down from 2019. We see that federally, we see that here in Maryland, but the reality is that the trends are still the same, right? We're still overwhelmingly arresting Black people, and that's here in the state of Maryland. So I think that whatever the legal mechanism we go through, whether it can be automatic, whether it can be manual, whether we have to have expungement fairs across the state, those actions need to happen.
Mm-hmm. And then I'd like to add that, I think a lot of times in the lens of the cannabis industry, so not talking about people that really understand criminal justice reform or anything like that, just from people looking at it from a cannabis perspective, they feel as though expungement has something to do with like being eligible for business licenses or anything like that. This is about allowing people the opportunity to live in society just like anyone else, knowing that they've been wrongfully convicted of a crime that shouldn't have been a crime. Knowing that this whole war on drugs was orchestrated because of greed, because mainly greed. Like when you really think about the core of it, it all goes back to greed, whether it is building up the private prison system and mass incarceration, to allow for very free or cheap labor in prison, or keeping certain industries afloat when the cannabis industry had the opportunity to wipe some of them out. Whichever perspective you take it from, it's about greed, so, and power and control. So now we're just trying to give people back their livelihood and give them back opportunity. This isn't going to necessarily fix the war on drugs or really right the wrongs, because I know that's something that we say a lot. We're trying to right the wrongs of the war on drugs. Well, expungement is not righting the wrongs. It's just maybe, erasing some of the things. And then we still have a lot to do to kind of make up for it. Mm-hmm. That's a whole nother story.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think those are really good points in the sense of, expungement is not some cure-all. People don't realize how many parts of your life, even just an arrest, can cost. Right? You don't even have to be convicted. Maybe you got arrested. You had to go spend the night in jail. You had to call your job and figure out what you were going to say the next day. You missed some sort of family event. Now you have to go to court to even get it dealt with, to get it dismissed, or, the overcharging. Mm-hmm. We don't talk about that fine line between, well, what is possession versus what is distribution? What kind of arguments can people make about distribution? Well, you can have up to 4 ounces as an allotment as a medical cannabis patient in Maryland. But if all those 4 ounces are individually packaged in eighths, now are you being charged as distribution?
Yeah,
probably. Again, when we look at these numbers, we can look at, in Maryland in 2019, for possession, there were 8,165 Black individuals arrested for possession. Now, that number did go down in 2020. There were only 627. But when you look at that as part of the percentages, what you see is that the percentage of people who were Black that were arrested for possession in Maryland actually went up. Mm-hmm. Right? We see the same thing for distribution. In distribution, there were 1,339 Black people arrested for distribution in Maryland, 70% in 2019. But in 2020, there were only 120 total for distribution, which is great. That's a significant amount, right? Significantly reduced. But 80% or 97 of those people were Black. So of the 120, nearly all were Black, and there were 2 Native American and 1 Asian people. So 100 of the 120 arrests for distribution.
Mm.
And what does that even mean to distribute? Are we talking about pounds here?
Right.
Probably not.
Probably
Right.
not.
And so, whether you can get a cannabis license or be a cannabis business holder or, have any sort of position within a cannabis company, I don't even think that that's probably what most people are thinking about when they're trying to figure out whether they can be eligible for expungement, right? We're talking about, can you apply for financial aid? I know people who weren't eligible to go to graduate school because they now had they had a cannabis conviction on their record, and now they can't get financial aid. And who can afford it when you're, disproportionately people of color are the ones affected by that. So the things that we're talking about here go far beyond, can you open up a cannabis business?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that is something the industry needs to think about, but also our government needs to think about, right? We can't complain about people not being contributing members of society when we don't give them the tools to get there.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Rita, you touched on something really interesting in that when you list the processes that go into these types of convictions and the reasoning for those types of convictions, Hope even mentioned whether it's for, labor in the prison system or to continue building up that complex. There's a lot of resources geared towards keeping the system in place the way that it is and making sure that it isn't disrupted in any way. One of the things that I remember hearing the court chief judge also say is that it would be estimated it would take several hundred additional clerks to go through millions of case records over a several year period for, expungement en masse or record sealing en masse to be even remotely effective. And when presented in this way, it can seem tonally that because it requires so much, we shouldn't do it. But on the flip side, we're dedicating so many resources to keeping it the way that it is. So what do you think our answer should be in the face of that type of pushback with, it'll take too long, or it will involve too much, or there's just simply not enough time to do it effectively in a way that we're planning to do it?
I think it took a long time to lock all those people up too.
Mm-hmm.
So why can't we use that time now? Now all of a sudden it's not important, right? We see, you don't have to live in Maryland or wherever you live. We all see government waste everywhere, right? We see things that, well, why does it take 10 steps to do that when it could have just been this one simple thing, right? And that all costs money, and you had to talk to 5 different people to get this one answer. And, so I think I find it really challenging to offer these reasons not to invest in our communities, right? We deserve to be invested in. And if that investment takes 700 clerks, look, our legal system, Maryland, United States, wherever you're at, they are overwhelmed. Absolutely. And that in itself is waste. But that doesn't mean that because that's happening, we then shouldn't care about Black and Brown communities who are disproportionately affected by these issues. There's also a lot of ways to get those records reviewed, right? You can hire clerks. We talk about getting people back into the workforce, right? We're right in the middle of a pandemic. We don't want to pay unemployment. We don't want to provide services. Great. Here's some job openings. Right. And we know that when people have money, then they can put money back into the economy. That's the way it's supposed to work, right? We do have prison labor. We do have jail labor. Great. Teach them how to read and look through these records. I had many, many clients. I was a former public defender. I had many, many clients who could talk their way around the courtroom. People aren't unintelligent simply because they're incarcerated.
I agree.
Right. A lot of times they're helping each other to figure out how to navigate the legal system because our legal system has failed them. And so, there's a lot of places that we could pull these resources from. We live in the DC area. There are, I think, 5 or 6 law schools here. Law students love to help. Law students need summer jobs too. So there's a lot of creative ways and creative solutions that we could address these issues other than just simply saying, well, it's just going to cost too much, so just forget it. Again, these are people's lives that are being affected and continue to be because we continue to arrest and prosecute people for marijuana possession and distribution.
And Rita, like you said before, it took a while to get here. We're okay with it taking a while to reverse it. I think what we're not okay with is saying, oh, that's too much, because you didn't say that back when we decided to change policies and target specific groups. So I think that would just make people feel as though, like I said, it doesn't fix the problem, but it's definitely a start.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And, even talking about some of those formerly incarcerated communities, some of those formerly incarcerated people and their transition, into, positions or other sorts of placements within the cannabis community or industry at large. There are states that have decided to regulate and bar ex-offenders with those types of convictions from maintaining employment within the industry. We've just talked about, how crucial and how valuable expungement can be, or similar services. And, after that, the next step should potentially be reentry. And we have these states that are deciding to regulate that as best they can for reasons to add legitimacy to the cannabis industry and to help prevent illegal sale. But how can those campaigning for the rights of formerly incarcerated people kind of combat those ideas, combat the ideas that employing formerly incarcerated communities will, take away that legitimacy that people are looking for from the cannabis industry?
Yeah. I think so. One, if you look at Maryland, does have a law that would potentially bar you from being a part of the industry if you have a certain type of conviction. So definitely, if you have a felony conviction, technically you are immediately disqualified. A misdemeanor, it's a case-by-case basis, to my understanding. And other states have taken a completely different approach and said, okay, actually, if you have a conviction, this can give you extra points, and you're more likely to be able to be a part of it, because they say they're trying to do that. The problem is there are no resources for these people once they get a license to be able to actually succeed. So that's a huge problem. And then a lot of times what they are is they're set up for a kind of a dumbed down or watered down version of the industry. So they might create these other types of smaller licenses, or have a cap on, how large and wide they can operate. Or they're given certain types of licenses, like delivery only, like in Massachusetts or something like that. And they're just not given the real opportunity to flourish in this space. So I think when we are talking about convictions as it turns into the industry, I think we have to be realistic and say, though, it shouldn't be a factor. Honestly, a lot of people who have run businesses on the legacy market likely can easily run any type of business that they want, not just a cannabis business, but any type of business. If you can run a large organization of people, no matter what type of organization that is, you can run a business. That's what a business is. So we need to be giving more resources to people. And I think especially people that have been impacted by the war on drugs should have free resources at their disposal that teach them how to turn skill sets into things that can make them productive members of society. We have to give tools for that combat recidivism, because a lot of people turn to doing the same things that got them locked up in the first place because they just can't find another way. If every job you try and go get, they're telling you no because you have this conviction and you can't go get any type of government assistance, you might not be able to find a place to live. Maybe your family moved on and left you. Who knows? Who knows what a lot of these people are going through. And then they just turn back to doing the same thing. So we have to, the prison system needs to be more of a reform system. We need to really, while people are inside and outside, inside, they need to have tools to be able to learn, teach, grow, and really give true reform. Outside, there need to be tools to be able to flourish in society. And right now, it's almost like we write these people off like they're not important. And we just leave them to dry. It's like, you have to figure it out. And which is kind of the sense of capitalism, which is run, our country is run by that. So we have to find that healthy balance of keeping our economy going, but still providing people with resources to succeed, because at the end of the day, it's going to make us stronger as a country. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what we have to remember. The more we are all successful, the stronger the country is. It shouldn't just be a top 1% of people flourishing and we're doing everything to protect them, making their taxes lower and all these things. We need to look at every demographic in our country and try and make sure every demographic has the tools to succeed, especially those impacted by the war on drugs.
Mm-hmm.
No, I think those are all really important points. And I think that, one of the first things we have to combat is still the stigma of being a criminalized person due to these laws that shouldn't even exist. I was on a community meeting about diversity and equity in a particular industry, and I won't say which one. And a white woman on that meeting effectively said that, well, if you've been doing these illegal things, you shouldn't be allowed to participate. And it's like, that's not the attitude that we need, right? And we need to value our legacy market. We need to value people who were doing this before any of us were, who were involved in,
who
who
created the demand that is now driving
exactly
the success of this industry. That's what I tell people all the time. I'm like, there's a reason why as soon as you open up a dispensary, people come, right? And it's not because of you. Like, it's because there was a demand there already, and now there's more visible access. People like the idea of, okay, I don't have to go to a corner and I don't know what's going to happen here, and because I'm doing something illegal, I could get robbed anyway. Like, no one wants to deal with that. So you open up a dispensary, likely the product is going to sell itself, and it's because other people have risked their lives and their livelihood to build this demand over the past 100 years. I mean, it's not new. This is not new.
No, exactly. And so I think then when we're already dealing with those attitudes about who's allowed to be in and who has to stay out, and then when we know that the people that you're trying to keep out are disproportionately Black and brown people, this racism that is just inherent in the cannabis industry is something that there still has not been a real reckoning on. Right. We can address small pockets here and there, but until we get over this idea that there are certain groups of people that are somehow better than others, that because you have a degree in cannabis something, that somehow now means you know more than the person who's been running their legacy business for the past 20 years and has been employing hundreds of people during that time and feeding their family and learned about the plant and grown the plant and learned about the science, but they don't have the money to go get that degree or get the business degree. There are people who don't have a law degree who can teach me things about law. So, we have to start putting that emphasis on that and recognize the value in people and what they bring, and then understand that we can all flourish, right? There is enough. I mean, if you only have to look at the numbers to see the projections of what we're talking about when we talk about a cannabis industry. And so this idea of having to split into groups, right? Or to, again, kind of divide and conquer. Right. Well, yes, but there are the Black and brown people who are doing it the right way versus those that are not. Our communities don't need you to do that splitting for us. So I think we also need to kind of start addressing some of this internal stigma and the kind of criminalization that some of the people in the cannabis industry seem to still be willing to support.
And this is something else I think about a lot when I think about expungement. I don't know the answer. So maybe one of you guys can give the answer to this. But something I think about a lot is, we always talk about expungement for people with nonviolent crimes, right? And a lot of the times, I don't know if that's fair. When we think about people who are getting arrested for a violent crime, so having a gun in your possession that's unregistered, that's a violent arrest, right? I mean, we criminalized this plant and we made it an underground business. People had to protect themselves. The government was not protecting them. Even me as a business owner that at one point was driving hundreds of thousands of dollars in my own car myself to the bank myself, I felt unsafe. And as someone that couldn't carry a gun, I felt unsafe, and I was a legal business. So I could only imagine being on the other side. What do we do about those people? Do they deserve to be still in prison? I think there's just a lot of work to be done. And to hear states say that they're not willing to invest in at least, that front line, we can't excuse that they were wrongfully convicted. I feel like that's step one, but we have a lot of work to do even past step one. There's going to be, I don't care if 100,000 people's records are expunged. There's going to be people, there are people that need to be let out of prison right now. Then there's a whole nother slew of people that have additional charges on top of their cannabis charges that need to be addressed. And we need to realize that all of it is caused by the targeting of this industry. You know, if this industry wasn't criminalized, a lot of people wouldn't be criminals. A lot of people wouldn't be carrying around guns or even having to use them or anything like that. They wouldn't be doing that if it wasn't a criminal business. So that's just something else I wanted to throw out for food for thought and how we can address those things. Totally down with going in order and getting what I can as I can get it. But these are things that I will use my platform to continue to bring awareness to and fight for.
And I think that's a really important point that you made is basically, you know, we've created, and I say we because we are all part of society. We have a voice to use to tell our legislators and our policymakers when we think they're doing things the right way or the wrong way. And when we don't, we become complicit in that system. And so I think that we have all allowed this space to flourish where we decide that things are violent or not. What does that mean for it to be violent, right? You've created, as Hope said, you've created this criminalization of this action, and then are going to further criminalize what they have to do to survive and to protect themselves. But we allow security guards in front of the dispensaries and the grows, and
they have guns.
And they have guns, right?
Bulletproof vests.
Right. And so, you know, so when we talk about these, you know, violent convictions or, oh, well, we're okay with it if it was non-violent. Well, what does that even mean? And as a lawyer, I know how easy it is for certain things to be characterized one way or the other. You could have the same tag and it means two completely different things. Maybe someone died over here, and maybe over here there was a gun in the car and there was 5 different people and we don't know whose it is, but everyone's getting the tag. Right. And that same kind of nuance happens when it comes to simple possession versus distribution. Well, maybe 6/8 we're going to say is okay. Oh, but now you have 8, and that's just a whole different game for some reason, but we don't know why. So I think, you know, being clear about what these things mean, both for our policymakers as well as for law enforcement, because I'm sure they're in a challenging space as well, trying to understand, well, what is the rule today? Is it different now? Or what should we be doing? Is there a policy? Are we not going to prosecute this? You know, I've heard from law enforcement who say like, yeah, this isn't really something we should be focusing on, but you know, they got to follow the rules too. So I think there is kind of a top-down effect, and we need to really look at, you know, what do these words mean? And if you don't understand the industry, if you don't understand the legacy market, that's okay. But there's people like us, like, you know, all 3 of us on this panel, everyone else who's been presented today, who can serve as those resources to help educate you so that we can make good policies, so that we're not sweeping up people that we don't really mean to, and we can provide everybody with the opportunities that they deserve.
Totally.
Definitely. Just in terms of closing, I want to say I thank you both for joining me today. Thank you, Rita. Thank you, Hope. Discussing not only the importance of expungement, discussing what potentially a roadmap for reentry means for some of those justice impacted communities. I think lastly, you know, before we completely close out, I would just ask, you know, we've talked about some of the more important things that cannabis companies and community organizations can do to further the work of expungement here in Maryland. What are the things that you would suggest that some of those same groups do, companies, organizations, even individuals do, to put the pressure on those with the power to enact some of the tangible change that we're looking for?
Well, you know, me as a community leader and realizing the platform that I have, you know, we've hosted expungement clinics ourselves at Marion, Maine. We have partnered with the Prince George's County District Attorney's Office to do so, which help speed up the process. And I think, you know, if everyone can kind of take inventory of the resources they have around them to be able to help further the mission, that's important. I think constantly talking to our legislators and trying to make this a mandate and get automatic expungement as a part of legalization, which is it's coming in Maryland in the next 2 years or so, year or two. So we can put this at a part of that bill and make it kind of a, look, this can't happen unless this happens. You know, we're seeing that even on the federal level, a lot of legalization efforts have been stopped because of the lack of criminal justice reform and social equity inclusion. So I think we have to do the same thing on the state level, and then everyone kind of look at what they can do individually to make a difference now. My expungement clinics normally help anywhere between 15 to 30 people or so every time they're open. And that's just, you know, 15 more people that potentially get a restart for their life. So although small, it makes a difference, and other people have ability to do the same.
Yeah, I think those actionable items are really important. There's a lot of folks in our industry who have the capacity to hold things like expungement clinics, to educate people on how they can expunge their own records. Some folks will be able to do it themselves, to partner with our state's attorney's offices throughout Maryland, which, as Hope says, takes out that extra step and makes it a little bit faster. And I think really most importantly, it's the same thing, I have young children and I tell them all the time, use your voice. No one can ever take that from you. They can take everything from you, but they cannot take your voice. So use your voice. Let your legislators and your policymakers know what you want, what's important to you, and don't stop until they give it to you.
Yes.
Couldn't have said it better. Again, thank you both for joining me today. We certainly appreciate, I say we in the general sense of the community, the industry as a whole, appreciate all the work that you both continue to do for our community, in most of all your advocacy and community engagement efforts. I definitely can speak to the ways that you've inspired both myself and dispensary that I'm at, Peak Relief, to take up the torch and continue to do the work and support those that are actively continuing to do the work, even when we're not in the best position to do it ourselves. So I want to say thank you to you both, and I hope that those that are watching right now, have something to take away from this, have some action items of their own, and feel more equipped to say yes to expungement. So thank you again.
Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you, Kevin.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
How's everyone?
Good, thanks.
Good. How are you?
Great.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Roz McCarthy. I'm the founder and CEO of Minorities for Medical Marijuana, and we are here today for our Montgomery County State Attorney's 2022 candidate debate. So before we begin, let me do a real brief intro, and we're going to get started, and I anticipate a great afternoon. Our first debater is Mr. Tom DeGonia, former president of the Montgomery County Bar Association and Family Justice Center and former assistant attorney's office, state's attorney's office. Sorry about that. Mr. DeGonia,
That's okay.
welcome.
Welcome. Thank you.
Pardon me for that. Our second participant is Ms. Bernice Marcoux North, criminal justice reformer and former prosecutor. Hello, Ms. Marcoux North. Good morning.
Marcoux North, yes.
Marcoux North, I got it right?
Marcoux North.
Marcoux North, got it.
Perfect.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for being with us.
Sure, thank you.
And last but not least, Mr. Perry Paylor, Deputy State's Attorney and Chief of Guns and Drugs Unit, Prince George County. Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
Welcome, welcome. I want to make sure that we also share with everyone the invitation to this debate were issued to all current candidates from Montgomery County, and so we are ready to begin. So our first question, again, we're talking about experience and enforcement currently at this time. The most recent FBI statistics for marijuana arrests, both possession and distribution, show clearly that while numbers are down, the trends remain. Black people are disproportionately arrested for marijuana offenses. How does your experience with marijuana and medical cannabis law enforcement, if any, inform your current position on the prosecution of marijuana laws in Montgomery County, including probation and pretrial offense? And we'll start with Mr. Paylor. You have 2.5 minutes, sir.
Wow, that's a big question.
I know, I'm sorry.
Okay, here we go. I'm going to jump into it. First, I want to thank the Cannabis Patient Advocacy Association for hosting all of us this afternoon. So thank you for putting on this Cannabis Policy Summit. I want to say hello to both Ms. Marcoux North and Mr. DeGonia. We run into each other, but it's good to finally be together, even though it's virtually. Okay, as you mentioned in my introduction, I serve as Chief of the Guns and Drugs Unit in Prince George's County, along with the title of Deputy State's Attorney. And I just want to give a little bit of historical context. In 2014, the General Assembly decriminalized marijuana, less than 10 grams of marijuana. Since that time, the Court of Appeals has issued about 4 opinions: Robinson versus State, Norman versus State, Pacheco versus State, and Lewis versus State. These opinions from the Court of Appeals reduced the incidents and the occasions in which marijuana could be used as the basis for searching and seizing of a person, right? So what we're seeing is that the Court of Appeals has been trying to indicate to us that because marijuana has been on the state level been placed into the legal stream of commerce, that our laws, our practices, and policies should reflect that. So when I came aboard as chief of the Guns and Drugs Unit, I was tasked with setting the policy for the office. First thing we did is we eliminated the practice of prosecuting possession cases. We no longer prosecuted any possession cases, and we were focusing more on the violence surrounding the legacy trade, specifically the homicides, contact shootings, and armed robberies that sadly are associated with the drug trade. At the same time, in 2019, what we found is that the General Assembly passed HB 1123 that legalized hemp. Now, hemp comes from the exact same plant, but it's the portion that tests under 0.3%. And so what happens is when a substance is seized by the police, you have to test it. Well, Maryland, our local drug labs in any county in the state did not have the ability to distinguish between hemp and marijuana. And so we found that to continue prosecuting possession will cost us $157,000 per month that was unbudgeted. So to get to the question, I got the sign that I had 30 seconds left. Know that it's within the stream of commerce, legally within the stream of commerce, we look at the exorbitant cost, and we had to make a determination that we can no longer prosecute possession, but we're in a position now that is confusing. It's confusing to both the police, the court, and the end user, and we need leadership to push us into legalization, because it's not safe now. It creates too much interaction between the citizens and law enforcement, which sadly ultimately ends up violent, particularly against young men of color. And that's because it's ambiguous. But when I'm state's attorney, I'm going to work with the delegation to push towards legalization for the pure purpose, for a lot of reasons, but mainly to stop the violence associated with the illegal drug trade, and to make sure everyone is operating on the same page, is treated fairly under law.
Thank you, sir. Mr. DeGonia or Mrs. Mercu North, any response?
I think I'll wait until we have our answers, and then I'll give any comments, kind of roll it in there, if that's okay with you.
Okay. Well, just know that you both get a response. If there's anything that you see from each other, you have a response, and we can do it at the end, or we can go forth. But again, you now get an opportunity to answer that question. Mr. DeGonia, your answer that question.
Could I have the question one more time, please?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So again, we the most recent FBI stats for marijuana arrests, both possession and distribution, show clearly that while numbers are down, the trends remain. Black people are disproportionately arrested for marijuana offenses. How does your experience with marijuana and medical cannabis law enforcement, if any, inform your current position on the prosecution of marijuana laws in Montgomery County, including probation and pre-trial offenses?
Great, thank you. And again, I'll echo Mr. Paler's comments to thank the Cannabis Patient Advocacy Association for hosting this today. And it's good to see Ms. Mercu North and Mr. Paler as well. I had the good fortune to be both a prosecutor in Montgomery County and serve as a defense attorney in Montgomery County. And I think we'd probably all agree that the illicit drug trade is certainly a violent one. And that is something that impacts all of us negatively. More so in minority communities, and the numbers that have been put out, there was a drop in the actual numbers from 19 to 20 in raw numbers, but the percentages disproportionately impacted communities of color, especially the Black or African American community, resulting in almost a 4% swing upward and a 10% swing upward in drug dealing arrests or charges in that same period. The goal, I think, has to be focusing on eliminating the illicit trade. I would support legalization, recreational use, obviously with appropriate regulations for adults, but the focus has to be on the illicit trade and eliminating that trade. In 2018 in Montgomery County, you had 18 homicides. 6 of those homicides were related to the drug trade. That was the buying, the selling of illegal drugs. Marijuana is moving towards and should continue to move towards legalization. Now, we have to be conscious of our price point there, because if we're too expensive, then we're going to continue to have that illicit trade. What we want to do is eliminate the illicit trade, move it into the light, and that's where we're going to help really on community safety. Now, Mr. Paler's point was a good one in that there is some confusion. There's confusion in the law. The odor of marijuana still gives us probable cause to make a stop. One of the things we have to do, and I think the state's attorney has to be the leader on this discussion, is changing the policies, not just the law, but we're policy implementers. And this is kind of where the rubber meets the road, is what cases are we going to pursue, what cases are we not going to pursue, and working with the police to set better priorities on who they're stopping, which are clearly disproportionately affecting communities of color. And we have to set policies that are going to address that disproportionate impact. And I think that's probably my time.
Yes, sir. But we'll come back with any rebuttals. Ms. Mercu North, your opportunity to answer that same question, please.
Yes. And I would echo Tom and Perry's welcome remarks. Thank you so much to the Patient Cannabis Advocacy Association and Mary and main channel for allowing us this platform to have this conversation. I just really appreciate this opportunity. So with respect to the question, in terms of my experience, I have served as both a former prosecutor in Anne Arundel County, as well as a criminal defense attorney in Montgomery County and neighboring jurisdictions. And I've seen the various aspects of how marijuana plays a role in the criminal justice system. I've seen how criminal priors for marijuana convictions as old as as decades old, can have an impact on someone's guilty plea later down the road, particularly as one prosecutor is trying to determine what the recommendation would be for a plea offer as well as sentencing. I've also seen the impact of how marijuana positive tests have had an impact on pretrial release as well as violations of probation. And we're coming to a point right now, and I've heard a little bit of the summit so far this morning, that we're coming to a point where legalization is coming down the road. And so as Madam State's Attorney, I would say that I would focus on not prosecuting marijuana cases and really looking at the case holistically, especially with regards to distribution cases. I know my counterparts have mentioned the illicit drug trade, which is also true, but you also have to consider there's situations where there might be just a young kid who makes a foolish decision, decides to sell marijuana. Those stories are still very evident in the criminal justice system, and they get the same treatment as one that has the more serious, violent situation in regards to marijuana circumstances in terms of selling the marijuana in large quantities. Now, in terms of enforcement, not only will I deal with not prosecuting marijuana cases, particularly with some of the distribution of marijuana cases, I also work with Annapolis as well as the county council to implement services that address the root cause of the issue. That can include dealing with employment issues, entrepreneurship skills, mental health issues, things that people don't really deal with when we're talking about just the prosecution. It's not just about the process of prosecution, it's about what's going on at the root cause of the individual. And that's the kind of prosecutor that I would be when I'm in that office.
Thank you. Awesome. Mr. Paylor, Mr. DeGonia, any other notes that you want to leave about your experience, what you bring to the table when it comes to, again, pretrial, looking at different aspects of enforcement in experience?
Yeah, real briefly, I do manage a diversion program for first-time drug dealers, and what we do is there's a component of 280 hours of community service, for accountability for breaking the law. But at the very same time, we offer payment for a certificate program through the community college to equip persons with skills. We partner them with employment services, and then we actually have a graduation. Upon graduation, the individual is given a PBJ and an immediate expungement. And that's one of the programs. It's called our Back on Track program, and it's modeled after Kamala Harris's Back on Track program that she started and when she was district attorney for San Francisco. Secondly, part of my administration, we would have a person designated to work with the planning board, to attend the planning board. When it comes to legalization, we need balanced growth throughout the county. We want to make sure that the dispensaries for recreational use are not all on the corner of Piney Branch University, all on the south and the east side, but we want to make sure that it's spread out evenly throughout the county, so one community doesn't, is not saturated with the recreational dispensaries. So we make sure that we have balanced growth throughout the county. And I do want to echo what Ms. North said, that it is important and as part of our platform to address the root causes, specifically the behavioral health implications. And our motto is going to be see the whole person, and that way we can present when tailoring our recommendations, whether it be a sentence, probation. We've dealt with medical professionals, and we've been able to see the entire person to give a full picture to the court.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Mr. DeGonia, Mr. McCool.
I think certainly we have to have a holistic approach and look at those root problems and solve the underlying problems of why someone feels that they have to engage in the illegal trade in order to be gainfully employed. I do want to speak to a couple of things on the Justice Reinvestment Act, which recently passed a couple of sessions ago, is a more progressive approach to technical violations for violations of probation. And one of the things that we have to look at is probation, not as a punishment, but as a tool to help someone recover, or as rehabilitative, not as a punishment tool. And certainly a positive test for marijuana is not something that should land somebody on a lengthy jail sentence, but should open up opportunities for more treatment. The other issue is that when people are arrested and they may have that lengthy record related to marijuana arrests, I want to eliminate cash bond so that you're not going to be looking at that as a factor to ask someone to be held on what may be a minor offense pre-trial. So I wanted to get back and address both of those points on pre-trial as well as possession. And then the other issue is, while if I get into a car and I get with 3 of my friends and they give me a little bit of money and we throw in together and we buy a little bit of weed and we're sitting in the car, I'm a drug dealer. That is I bought drugs, I've distributed drugs, and that's the law. That is technically, you have now distributed drugs. What we want to do and what we have to do is look at that as policy leaders and say, this is not someone who should be addressed as or looked at as a drug dealer. This is someone who is coming into contact with the criminal justice system. Let's look at a better solution to that problem than engaging them in the system.
Thank you, sir. Ms. McCoo North.
Yes, and actually, Tom brought up a good point regarding looking at it, the whole picture as to what's going on, as opposed to just kind of having a blanket interpretation of what a drug dealer actually is. That's something that I've personally experienced at the U.S. At the State's Attorney's Office. I've represented young adults that get caught up in making a bad decision, distributing marijuana, and they are characterized as drug dealers, as simple as that. And I think that's the wrong direction that we're going. And that's why this race is a competitive race to change the landscape of how we're viewing these those that are accused of marijuana cases. One thing I did want to add, we'll kind of expand upon in terms of the partners. Let's not forget the federal partners, our congressmen, and our state senators, because when it comes to marijuana convictions, they have ramifications at the federal level. If you are a student, you will lose federal funding if you have a drug conviction, including marijuana conviction. That's not specified in the current law. And so that's the kind of leadership that I would take on to work with the congressional delegation, Maryland congressional delegation, and the senators to try to make sure that while we are trying to decriminalize marijuana at the local level, it's not having ramifications at the federal level as well.
Nice. Thank you so much. As we go on to our next question, and you kind of touched on it just a little bit, regarding expungement. In 2020, Maryland medical cannabis dispensary sales reached $423 million, while a bill that would have automatically expunged an estimated 200,000 minor cannabis convictions was vetoed by the governor. Recently, Los Angeles District Attorney George Gascon's office announced it would dismiss nearly 60,000 marijuana-related convictions to clear barriers in society. Similar and related efforts are underway in jurisdictions across the country. What is your position on an approach to expungement as a path to successful reentry? And we'll start with Mr. DeGonia, please.
Thank you. It's a great question, and it's one of those questions where we have to deal with the past in order to move forward. And what we have, and this was a conversation I actually had with Delegate Luke Clippinger just last weekend at a lecture at the University of Baltimore Law School, which is we have to go back, and if we're going to decriminalize and legalize, which is where I think we should be going, the use, recreational use, we have to go back and aggressively help people clean up their records. It prevents them from getting jobs. It prevents them from moving forward. It also counts against them if there's a subsequent offense. I had the good fortune to work with Montgomery County's pre-release center, where we help reintegrate folks who are returning both from federal and state and local systems back into the workforce. That is one of the biggest stumbling blocks. We can get you connected with education resources. We can get you connected with interviewing and with our local workforce. But we can't go back and change what your record was. The record is what the record was. And now we've got really a 5-year look back window. And this is one of the things that we discussed. And I think it's critical that the state's attorney's office take the lead, not only on helping people get the expungements that they are eligible for now, but takes the lead both with our county council and our legislature, both the Senate and the House, on looking at legislation that's going to help us go back further. Because if you were convicted of possession 10 years ago, there's really not an avenue for you to go back and clean that up now. And we've got to look at that. And is it the type of case where this was 4 guys in a car and they were smoking some weed together and one of them is a drug dealer? Air quotes. Should that be something that's on the table as well? I think it is. Was this a violent offense? Then maybe that's not one. It's going to take a lot of time to get through some of those more complicated cases. But absolutely, if it's a simple possession from 10 years ago, that's something you should absolutely be able to go back and revisit. So I think we need to look at it both from a legislative perspective and a policy perspective in the office. One of the other things that we have to do is, with a robust conviction integrity unit, that's something that's going to allow us to look at sentences or revisit sentences as we go back, not just on the expungement level, but on the overall sentence. Is this someone who at the time, had they committed this offense today, would be entitled to or should be entitled to a review or a reconsideration of that sentence? So I think it's not just at the lower level on expungements, it's a much bigger picture.
Yes, thank you, sir. Next, we have Ms. Marcoux North, please.
Marcoux North.
Your thoughts on that subject.
Yes. Yes. Thank you. So first, I want to say I've always been a big proponent of cleaning one's slate. When I, as a private attorney, I actually testified in Annapolis on a bill that then Delegate Mosby had sponsored to expand the use of the power to vacate convictions to defendants, because currently, as it stands, only a prosecutor has the power to vacate convictions. And that's the kind of advocacy that I would continue as Madam State's Attorney, as well as promoting automatic expungements, particularly as with the sunset clause. After a certain number of years, having those convictions and records on the books is no longer a public safety issue. And we have to be very cognizant of that as prosecutors, to making sure that we're really achieving justice and safety in a fair manner. In addition to promoting automatic expungements, I will also, and Tom touched on this briefly, I will also expand the current conviction integrity unit to include guilty pleas and misdemeanors, because that's really where, in Montgomery County, that's where the bulk of the prosecutions are happening. That is where the bulk of prosecutions are happening, where a lot of the injustices are easily overlooked because it's considered a misdemeanor level offense, but they have ramifications long term. And having the ability to at least have a screening unit in the office to kind of look at the old cases to say, hey, look, maybe this is something that we need to consider and bring up to the court is very critical. Because as I mentioned earlier, the Maryland law allows the prosecutor's office to vacate convictions. Now, it's different from expungements. Expungements clear out the record. So police officers, the police stations, other agencies are going to clear the records when an expungement happens. A conviction is just really, icing on the cake to have it vacated. And that is the current law in place. Promoting automatic expungements in conjunction with promoting vacating convictions, expanding that power, as well as having a more robust conviction integrity unit are really the pathways to gaining reentry. And when you're at the point of reentry, the question is, how do you sustain yourself now that you've had everything expunged? And so it comes down to economic opportunities, as well as housing. It's a big part of the package of true reentry into the system. Make sure you have a place to sleep and a job to go to, so you feel like you're a productive member of society. Clean slate doesn't mean that you didn't do what you did. It just means you have paid it to society, and it's time to move forward and help our economy and our communities grow.
Thank you, Mr. Paler.
Yeah, and I think we all agree on this subject that it's imperative that we have automatic expungements. And I just wanted to be, it's important for the automatic part. And I think we should go back as far as we need to, as far as our records will allow us to go back. So I don't think we should stop at 5 or 10 years. And I don't think we should have to track down someone who got a possession conviction in 1983, right? I think it should be automatic. I think that there are a lot of implications. One of the things that you'll see on down on Capitol Hill, they're trying to pass legislation for the infrastructure bill. Well, there's going to be a lot of contracting opportunity. A lot of jobs are going to be available and contracting opportunities that come from this legislation. As state's attorney, it's going to be my duty to provide a workforce, an eligible workforce, to take advantage not only of the jobs, but the HUD loans, the EDI loans, that you need a clear record to, when you have a small business and you want to apply for those loans. You shouldn't have to put that on an application or in an interview that you got a conviction back in 1985 for possession, right? And it's now, time is of the essence. We can't wait another 3 or 4 years. We need to have our residents able to take advantage of this economic opportunity now. And so I'm hoping we can get something done this session, because we want to have our residents able to take advantage of this economic opportunity. And I think that's one of the main things we can do, is have them have, clean records to be able to take advantage of the opportunities coming. Because let's be frank, it's a lot of money coming out of there. And we want our small business owners to be able to take advantage of that opportunity. Also, I've heard mentions of conviction and sentencing integrity units. As deputy, in Prince George's County, I actually I manage part of that unit, and we do see applications all the time for sentences to be reviewed, and that's something I would bring to Montgomery County to ensure that we're constantly reviewing our convictions, but also the sentences, to make sure that the sentences were fair and that they met the standard of law, and not only standard of law at the time, but is that standard appropriate for today, right? Because time, culture, feelings change about different offenses. So we want to make sure that a sentence, with drug sentences back in the 80s and 90s, they were extensive, right? And we know that some people are still serving time for some drug convictions, that time has changed how we feel about certain convictions. So I think that we always be in a position to review sentences. And I got the sign. My time is up. I can keep going.
This could be a topic we talk about for hours, right?
Yes, expungement surgery.
I think we all could.
Yes. I think something that came up, Mr. Paler, that you said that you kind of all agree. And I want to, before we go into our next question, give everyone the opportunity for rebuttal. If there's anything in regards to your approach towards expungement, I want to allow you guys to have a few last minute comments before we go to our next question.
I'll jump in, I guess, on that in rebuttal. Not really rebuttal, but I guess it's more of how we go about it. The issue, and it's a good thing we've got timers, because I think all three of us could probably talk all day about any of these issues. But one of the things on the conviction integrity unit that I've pledged to do is I'm going to hire a former defense attorney or a person from the Office of the Public Defender who's going to report directly to me on the sentences that they review, including expungements. We're going to go after that. We're going to look at them aggressively to make sure that they are comport with the policies that we have in place now. We're going to publish our criteria for application, but more importantly, we're going to publish to the community the number of cases we review and the outcomes and results of those. I think that's critically important, that people feel comfortable that information is transparent and it goes to people's belief in the system. If you know what the sentences are, you know that you're reviewing them, you know that there actually is relief being sought and being granted, I think it's critically important to the foundation of people believing that we've got a fair and just system. So God bless you. So I think that's important, and I think that's a distinction, because we want to change the mindset, and that's why I'm willing to bring somebody from the outside in, have them be a direct report, publish that information as it relates to what expungements, what categories of crimes we're going to expunge, what categories of crimes we're also going to seek to reduce those sentences, or make sure that's an appropriate sentence if it's still an appropriate sentence.
Yes, sir.
And
Ms. Marcoux North,
Yes.
comments, or Mr. Paler?
Well,
ma'am.
I actually, I actually echo what Tom has said. That's pretty much part of my plan as going in as Madam State's Attorney. In addition to what I've briefly touched on, was a screening unit for those requests that do come in from defendants, because as I mentioned, in terms of vacating convictions, only prosecutors have the power to do that. And there's no mechanism in place to deal with the fact that sometimes defendants just want to bring to one's attention, hey, look, maybe we should take a look at this case. There's no mechanism for that. So I would create a screening unit to go through those requests to determine whether it is worthy enough to actually have it brought before the court to have the matter vacated. And in regards to the automatic expungements, it is truly a state issue with the assistance of county leaders like State Attorney's Office, kind of pushing for why it's so critical and how it really doesn't. Some of these cases that are that could be eligible for automatic expungement, like a lot of marijuana possessions, doesn't do anything to promote public safety. And that's really the mindset that we need to focus on. It's more about public safety, not about punishment. People pay their debts to society, and we need to have people move on from that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And just a brief response. Yeah, I think we currently in the unit that in our office, we have public defenders, but it takes it's going to take about 4 attorneys. So it's not, if you look at the volume, and we understand the caseload in Montgomery County, in terms of allocation of resources, to have a serious, real conviction and sentencing integrity unit, it's going to take about 4 attorneys. So I would make it available to a public defender. We have a former public defender in our office now, but we're looking for the resources to expand that unit. And that goes with, I have experience with this. Some are on the general fund, but there's also a lot of grant funds available. And so we take advantage of it now. And I would, as state's attorney, continue to take advantage of grant funding to shore up that unit, to get it to any place close to 4, in a perfect world, 5. Montgomery County has about 153 full-time employees, somewhere around 80 attorneys. But I think that we'd have to rely on grant funding to get that unit up to where it would need to be. And their budget is close to the budget we have.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you. Got me.
No, thank you. I know they pull a plug on us, but we're gonna keep it rolling.
Okay.
we can keep things going here. So our next question, and this is something real critical, and we got to think about what's going on here. It's about legal use markets. And so the question is, 48 of 50 states have some form of legal cannabis market. In the state of Maryland, the current market is solely medical. If Maryland established an adult use legal market tomorrow, what are the top 2 considerations you hope would be taken into account? And I want to start with Mrs. McCurry. Oh my gosh, you have to excuse me. I don't know why I can't get you out today, but Ms. McCurry, I apologize. Listen, I don't know what it is, but the lovely lady, this question is yours.
Thank you so much. So yeah, this is a very, very clearly hot topic. And also the first thing I would consider is entrepreneurship training through social equity programs in the state of Maryland. Oftentimes, the people that have dabbled in the business of marijuana use and get the convictions aren't the ones able to get into the program. So because you get into legalization of marijuana in the business because of their record. So having an opportunity perhaps through entrepreneurship training or other resources to help them prepare to not only enter into the market legally this go around, but to sustain themselves legally is very, very critical. And that's probably the first thing that I would focus on in terms of getting more people into the market that were through the laws of the state of Maryland shut out and criminalized because it was no longer because it was not a legalized act. Now that it is legalized, which goes to my second point, having regulatory thresholds that aren't using criminal convictions as a barrier to meet them, particularly with licensing or other requirements to get the businesses up and running. Oftentimes, a criminal conviction can hinder that, and that includes a marijuana conviction. Allowing the opportunity to overcome that and being conscious of that is very, very critical in terms of actually people getting into the market. Because as was, I think, scrolled through it was in the scroll earlier in terms of the disproportionate arrests of possession. Let's look at the disproportionate arrest of distribution cases. And let's look at, and I forgive me, I don't have exact numbers, but look at the racial makeup of the businesses that are actually in the legal cannabis market. Very different from the makeup of the ones that are getting arrested for distribution, right? Mostly Black people getting arrested for distribution cases, and mostly white people that are actually going to benefit from the legal cannabis market. And that is a unjust reality that needs to be dealt with through, as I mentioned, through these entrepreneurship programs and services, as well as making sure that the thresholds to actually get into the business is not going to be thwarted by one's criminal conviction, especially for marijuana. I've had clients that went against become small business owners, but their records are holding them back. Therefore, their economic ability is holding them back. Therefore, public safety is at risk. If you don't have a job, if you don't have a place to stay, public safety is at risk. And that's why we have to change the way we're looking at public safety by promoting economic mobility.
Nice. Next, we have Mr. Paler. Your response to this question.
Yeah, a couple of things. I mentioned it early. Balanced growth. Like I said, I would work with the planning department to make sure that any dispensaries, any retail outlets are evenly distributed throughout Montgomery County. Right. I worry about the model of the liquor stores in the 70s, where all of the liquor stores were on certain areas, certain blocks, certain corners, and I would want to make sure that we had balanced growth. Also, sadly, there are impacts. We've seen models in Colorado, specifically as it relates to auto-related DUI charges, traffic fatalities, things of that nature. So we would want to make sure that two things. One, that we have public education funding to make people aware of some of the impacts and the effects of driving under the influence, but also make sure that our law enforcement has the resources, particularly as it relates to drug recognition experts, things like that, to make sure that we continue to keep our roadways safe. So, like I said, we've seen in places where we have legalization that there has been an uptick in the incidence of DUIs related to marijuana, and also, sadly, traffic fatalities. So I think we have to make sure that we adjust our resources appropriately. And I think those are two of the things that we can do to make sure we keep our residents safe.
Yes, sir. And Mr. DeGonia, same question. What are some of the top two considerations you would hope to be taken into account if Maryland were to go legalize tomorrow?
If we're looking at this more from our public safety responsibility and keeping our community safe, I certainly agree with Ms. Mercury North on the issue of making sure that we're having this opportunity fairly distributed amongst people, all entrepreneurs, and also making sure that I think all the things we talked about in our expungement, so that you're eligible to get into that business if you want to be involved in that business. But one of the big issues that I have and a concern that I'd want to see addressed is really a quality assurance issue, because we see illicit marijuana or illicit drugs that are laced with other drugs. And I see that really as the opportunity we have in legalizing the trade to make sure that the quality and so people know the drug that they are getting. And I would support a broad distribution of those dispensaries. And Montgomery County, fortunately, has some models to draw on with the ABS, the Alcoholic Beverages Services, that's regulated by the county. But liquor stores, and I think Mr. Perry makes a good example, you don't want it just in one place, you want it dispersed. So you're not disproportionately impacting any neighborhood, but you're also keeping regulation on this. The other issue is, well, again, we don't want to overprice ourselves out of this market so that you are still funding the illicit trade. And so I think pricing and accessibility are going to be important issues as well. And that with that comes transparency. So I think the quality assurance, so that you know the quality, whether it's a medical or a recreational, whatever the legislature decides on what the quality of the product should be, I think is critically important, because we don't want to see people who think they're getting a legitimate quality product that may be laced with something else, which oftentimes comes up in the illicit trade. So I think those are really the quality assurance, and the transparency and location issues are critical to the success, and also to the safety.
Yes. So you guys have mentioned entrepreneurship training, distribution is equal throughout Montgomery County, equal opportunity for businesses, public safety, quality of product. Before we transition to our next question, is there anything else on the table, anything else that you would want to see from a legalization perspective, if it were to happen tomorrow, that you would want to make sure we're in place? And that's free, open for the next minute and a half response from anyone.
Well, I mean, I'll jump in on that, because I think one of the problems, and Mr. Paler alluded to this before, is there's some confusion in the law right now. And what we have to do, or what I have to do as the state's attorney, is give guidance to law enforcement to say, how are we going to enforce this? So certainly what we need to do, and what the next state's attorney needs to be doing, is working with the legislature on explaining and educating them on the issues that I'm going to face as making policy as the chief law enforcement officer, and directing police officers what to charge, what not to charge. So we're going to want a lot of direction from the legislature, and I think that's going to be a critical issue as we move forward, is educating our legislators both on both committees, as well as health and government oversight committees, and working with our county council on how we're going to actually implement these regulations is going to be critical.
Yeah, and if I could just follow up on that.
North,
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
No,
I
go
was
ahead.
going to, okay. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Perry. Go ahead, please. You're starting.
No, I was just going to follow up with that, and it's what we're going to have to see is the transition from it being an illegal substance to policing, regulating, and monitoring, close to what we do with tobacco, right? And so, but the main thing working with law enforcement is going to be changing the culture. We had to change, as deputy state's attorney, I had to change the culture from policing possession cases to constantly sending the message that we will no longer prosecute possession cases. So therefore, you will no longer arrest, or not only arrest, but interact and harass and communicate with those that you suspect are only at the possession level. Well, the same thing is going to have to go to as we transition to legalized distribution, right? So we're going to have to work hard at changing the culture. You have police officers have been on the force 15 and 20 years that, they're automatically triggered that marijuana is a legal substance and it's probable cause to search, seize, and encounter. And now we're going to have to work to change that culture within law enforcement as we transition to it being part of, the legal stream of commerce. And as state's attorney, it's going to be incumbent on me and my office to lead that culture shift. And that's going to be one of the main things we want to do to really make sure that our citizens are safe, or to reduce the number of encounters between police and citizens as it relates to marijuana use.
And
Thank you,
what
sir. Yes, ma'am. Ms. North.
Yes, and what I would add is two additional points. We've touched on the public safety aspect of it, but in Montgomery County, there is a high number of renters and multifamily dwelling units, and we have to work with those particular buildings to deal with the fact that because there's legalization of marijuana, it's infiltrating people's apartments, right? They didn't sign up for that. When they signed their lease, they didn't sign up to be dealing with marijuana smoke and possibly having markets happening in people's home-based businesses, for instance, if that's were to be the case. So we need to work with the tenant associations or the apartment builders to understand how it's impacting the individuals when we're actually getting ready to open this adult use legal market, if it were to open tomorrow. I think that's a very important partnership to develop with the state's attorney's office, because that's something that doesn't really get talked about a lot. But again, there's so many renters in Montgomery County. It's a very unique issue to Montgomery County, especially in terms of development and working with the planning board, as Perry mentioned. In addition to what actually Perry mentioned with the planning board, and Tom mentioned this a little bit too, with where these dispensaries are going to be placed, it's also about who has access to them. Look at what happened with PPP, for instance, the number of large corporations that just bought up created all these LLCs to get the funding. The same could happen with these small businesses. Small businesses try to get that one lot in Montgomery County, but they might be suffocated in competition if there's other large corporations able to monopolize on that. So those are things to consider as well in developing the adult use market.
Yes, thank you so much. I think all of your responses were right on target. And as we transition to our next phase of the debate and this conversation, I want to set it up for all those viewers that we have out there, that I'm going to be asking individual questions for each candidate, and the candidate will be able to give their response, and then the remaining candidates will have a rebuttal to that response. And so these questions are very individualized and very specific based on something that you may have said or your position in the past. So we're going to start with Mr. DeGonia. In a recent article, you stated that the current office is out of step with current thinking. If elected, what steps will you take to get the current office in step with current thinking?
Well, what I meant when I said that was that we've got a legislature who is popularly elected in Montgomery County. We have a council who is popularly elected and who are moving forward and are engaged with the public. They're listening. They're seeking out input from the public on new laws and how they go about implementing those. The state's attorney has got to engage with the public and problem solve in the communities that we serve. I'm going to put my prosecutors, I'm going to put a senior prosecutor out in each one of the police districts. And that's going to serve a couple of things, but one of the primary functions is to better engage with the community so that we understand what the community enforcement priorities are, what are the public safety issues in that particular community. The state's attorney's office has got to be the lead voice on public safety and accountability. And that means working with our communities, both at the state level and our local leaders, our faith-based organizations, our nonprofits, and law enforcement to come up with better public safety solutions. And to be positioned as the leader on reform with our partners and resources, we have to do that through listening to our partners. We've got to try new ideas, and we've got to look to other models, whether they're adjoining jurisdictions, whether they are other states. We have to look for those, be willing to try those new ideas, implement them, and look to other models, and all at the same time building coalitions with those partners to ensure that if we make those changes, and when we make those changes, we're all moving forward together. We can't keep prosecuting things the same way we've been doing them for the last 20 years and expect different outcomes. One of the topics we've been talking about is obviously marijuana and cannabis use, which has changed dramatically in how we move forward. So it really is about the state's attorney demonstrating the leadership and coalition building, listening to the community, participating with the community, and I mean community writ large, that is everyone, and then coming up with a response that is focused on safety, not just on passing cases through the way they've been coming through the system. So it's really about being a problem solver in chief, and not just a case processor.
Ms. Marcoux North, any response to that? Anything you want to share from that perspective?
Yes, as co-chair of our county's Reimagining Public Safety Task Force, I definitely had my fair share experience listening and coalition building with a lot of different stakeholders on the issue of public safety. And one thing that I noticed was missing and why I did decide to run was the lack of vision and leadership. That's what really got my attention. There are some leaders in county government that get it, and some did not. And there was a lot of back and forth with our current state's attorney and other activists where there was clearly a clash in the direction moving forward in public safety. And that comes from not having the right vision that meets the needs of our community. So listening is important, but not having a vision or principles as to why we're moving forward in the way we're doing is very critical to consider when we're talking about reimagining public safety in Montgomery County.
Great, thank you. Mr. Paylor, again, in response to the question that we asked Mr. DeGonia in regards to anything that he may have said.
Yeah, and I just think the engagement is the key. We're talking about, Dr. King talked about leadership, and there's two kinds, the thermostat or the thermometer. Do you take the temperature, do you set the temperature? And as the state's attorney for Montgomery County, it'd be incumbent upon me to actually set the temperature. And when we talk about police reform, criminal justice reform, it takes engagement and over communication. One of the things that I do as deputy state's attorney, our leadership, we meet monthly with command staff, and we have a separate meeting with the FOP. And every month we set forth our goals, our expectations, our policies, and our practices. They know every month what we're going to prosecute, what we're not going to prosecute, and also the conduct from them that we'll tolerate and conduct that we won't. We were in the news last week. We did release our do not call list, and those are officers based on whether it's integrity issues or evidence of racial bias, that we had to draw a hard line that you will no longer testify. We will no longer sponsor your testimony against an accused in the county, because we felt that strongly that we have to hold our officers to a higher standard. But that didn't come in as a surprise. We had, since the beginning of the administration, we have been in constant communication with law enforcement, not only the county, but our municipal law enforcement as well. It is incumbent upon the state's attorney to set the standard. Our citizens are relying on us to set the standard in which they will be policed. And you have to do that. It's engagement. You have to over communicate. We're setting expectations of the police. We hear a lot of complaints about the police. We have to engage, communicate, and educate so they understand clearly what our citizens expect from them. And the state's attorney, that's something that I do as deputy, and I will continue to do as state's attorney for Montgomery County.
Thank you, Mr. Paylor. Before we go any further to our next question, any other rebuttal, Ms. McCoo North, Mr. Degonia, Mr. Paylor, on this question for right now?
Not. I'm good.
We're good.
Okay.
I think we covered it all. Thank you. Our next question, Ms. McCoo North. In a recent article, you stated that we need to know the lens on what justice means. If you are elected, what will you implement to ensure the state attorney's office knows the lens on what justice means in Montgomery County?
Yes, and before I get into my answer, I just want to again thank you, the Patient Cannabis Advocacy Association and Mary Main Channel, for having this opportunity, for allowing me to expound upon that particular phrase. I remember I saw it in the article. I said, yeah, I wish I had the opportunity to explain more. So thank you for this question. I'm not wearing them right now, but I wear glasses. And every few years you have to change your lenses. That's just part of, a lot of people's situations. I see two people wearing glasses right now. And the reason why I framed that in that conversation around criminal justice is that sometimes people are comfortable with the frames, even though they need to have the change in the lens, right? But you can't change your glasses without changing the whole set. You need to change the framework, you need to change the lens, you need to change the prescription as to what will make you see better. And you'd be surprised on what you're missing out on if you don't have a new pair of glasses. And so I brought up that metaphor because when we're talking about changing the lens on justice, it's really a perspective shift on what justice looks like in Montgomery County. And that is the reason why I'm running and why I have been so active in not just police, but criminal justice reform in Montgomery County. I am running on 4 principles of change in the office because I think I had the right, to carry on with the metaphor of prescription as to what justice should really look like in Montgomery County to keep communities safer. And that's going to include greater accountability and transparency, not just with the police, with our fellow prosecutors. I have a law practice, but I've also managed a lot of attorneys through different organizations and different volunteer opportunities. And I also managed a lot of community members as well. It takes a team of folks to really be on the same page and to have, Mr. Pillar mentioned this earlier, but to have these monthly meetings, having these conversations to make sure we're all in the same framework and seeing things similarly as to how justice really in Montgomery County. So greater transparency and greater accountability, not just with the police, including releasing do not call lists, which has not been done in Montgomery County yet, and being accountable to each other's prosecutors is very critical and one of my first priorities, as well as alternatives to incarceration. And that includes treating kids as kids and not criminalized adults. Dealing with the trauma of youth is very critical, and not just treating them as adult criminals in the justice system, as well as dealing with equity in how we're prosecuting the cases, making sure we're not perpetuating the racial harm and bias that comes, unfortunately, inherent in the criminal justice system, as well as restoring communities and stabilizing communities. And that includes protecting the victims from seniors, children, human offenses, domestic violence, wage theft. We're really kind of opening the landscape as to how we're really making communities stronger. And that comes with being a prosecutor that's focused on transformative change and making sure we get to the root cause of the crime, to make sure that we're all in this together and making sure we're all safe together in our communities.
Wonderful. Nice. Mr. Paler and Mr. Degonia, Mrs. Marcoux North talked about the lens. Do you have a response in regards to her comments and the lens in the justice system there in Montgomery County?
Well, yeah, just briefly, I too have practiced in Montgomery County and neighboring practices. I started my career as a prosecutor in Prince George's County, but I maintained private practice for 15 years, and I practiced in all the jurisdictions in Maryland, Montgomery, Prince George's, Howard, and Arundel. And I did notice a difference in how certain defendants were treated when it came to Montgomery County. I did notice a difference, particularly if maybe English wasn't your first language. I did notice a difference how pro se people, those that didn't have attorneys, got different offers, particularly in the district court, that sometimes I just would leave. My client was treated fairly, but I couldn't just pick up my briefcase and leave when my client was treated fairly. I would look behind me and say, hey, man, this person's not getting the best deal that they would have. And that kind of really started, me thinking about what's going on in this office. It's not where it should be. Currently, there are 24 elected state's attorneys. There are only 4 African-American deputies in the state of Maryland. I'm one of 4. 2 of us live in Montgomery County, but we drive 30 miles away to work in Prince George's County. So one of the things that's going to be important to me is to ensure that the office looks like the residents of Montgomery County. And like I've said before, the standard is going to be excellence. To work in the state's attorney's office, the standard is going to be excellence. I just believe excellence expands beyond one particular race or gender. I believe we can find excellence throughout all folks, and I think that people have to know that you don't have to attend a certain particular Catholic school or be a basketball player to get hired in that office. It's going to be excellence, but it'll be an open office, and our friends or our residents, when their children graduate from the public schools and do the things they have to do, they'll be able to come home to Montgomery County and have a fair shot at a job and working in the county. And I think that's, homegrown prosecutors bring a perspective, and they know the community, and I think that we're losing that now. And also, we're going to have diversity in leadership. Right now in that office, sadly, there is none. And when I'm state's attorney, we will make sure that everyone who works hard does the job the way it's supposed to be done. They'll have a fair opportunity to apply for leadership positions in that office.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Degonia.
Well, let me start off by saying I agree with Ms. Marcoux North that we need to change the prescription, and I'll agree with Mr. Paler that we have to be committed to diversity in that office. There's not a major team that's led by a person of color in that office right now. As the past president of the Bar Association, we have almost 3,000 members of our Bar Association. Last year, I served as the president, and we created what was called the Racial Justice Council. We partnered with the American Society of Black Psychologists. We brought them in. We did trainings over 20 weeks. It was called the 20 and 20 program. The State Bar just recognized that program. We partnered with the bench. We partnered with private practitioners, and we educated and took an affirmative step towards educating our bar members about not only diversity issues, about historically disproportionate impacts, about redlining, about white privilege. We had some very hard discussions, and that's something that we've got to engage in. My prosecutors will be required to do that training. They'll also be required to go to any facility. They're going to ask for a sentence for somebody. They're going to go to that facility before they're allowed to ask for a sentence, whether it's a juvenile detention facility, a state facility, or a local facility. They're also going to be required to we're going to do a program with both the Holocaust Museum as well as the African American History Museum. So my prosecutors are going to understand the impact of the decisions that they're going to have on other people's lives. So I think it's critically important. We do have a new prescription. We do have people, who are change agents in that office, and I'm committed to affirmatively recruiting people to come into the office who are local, who are qualified, and who are the best at what they do.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Marcoux North, did you have a rebuttal or response to your colleagues here and their thoughts on your question?
Yeah, I would just add that I think it goes it's kind of a mixture of Perry and Tom's point, that it goes beyond just going to a museum or just meeting somebody local. Really having people to provide an understanding of what it's like to go through the system. I think that's another aspect that needs to be addressed. I know in Philadelphia, there's a art in residence program, for instance, where you actually get to hear from folks who have been incarcerated, been through the system in the state's attorney's, well, in the district attorney's office in Philadelphia. And that's a particular program that I'm interested in bringing to Montgomery County. We have a plethora of art organizations in Montgomery County. We're rich in them. And I think they would love the idea to try to work with the state's attorney's office so people can understand what's going on in the psyche of someone that's been through the system and trying to reenter into society. So it's not just where you are and what you've seen, but your willingness to accept the harsh realities of our system. That innate, that natural acceptance of the difficulties of being through the system, and then you having to be an agent of the criminal justice system is something that has to be working in conjunction as you're working as a prosecutor. Currently, as Perry touched on, there's a lot of good old boy mentality in that office, and that's just not the makeup of the county. Is a majority minority. There's a significant portion of people who are foreign born, about 1 in 4. I'm a child of African Americans myself, so I am very sensitive to the fact that the culture has to be more diverse and more like the county that we're living in and that we're moving towards.
Thank you, Ms. Marcoux North. Great response, Mr. Paylor, Mr. Degonia. Before we go on to question number 3, I want to make sure that we have not left anything on the table that you want to share.
No, I'm good.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. Yes, sir. Thank you. Our next question, our third question, and this is for you, Mr. Paylor. In a recent article, you mentioned that justice is not evolving at the appropriate pace in Montgomery County. If elected, what steps will you take to make sure justice moves appropriately in Montgomery County? You have 3 minutes.
Okay, well, yeah, first of all, like I've mentioned a couple of times, I do sit as Deputy State's Attorney in Prince George's County, and we are by far the most progressive State's Attorney's office in the state of Maryland. So we have a plethora of diversion programs, and diversion program is that period between arrest and conviction where we find a place to intervene, to find a place of accountability, but also a person can preserve their record and go on and lead a productive life. We have, like I said, we have one for drug dealers, we have juvenile diversion programs, we have misdemeanor diversion programs. So we lead in that area, but also juvenile lifers. What is now the Juvenile Justice Restoration Act, we started the Juvenile Lifers program where we review the sentences of juvenile lifers, and actually we have been successful in having 2 released from our office after they've served 20 years of their sentence. And we had to have some of the tough conversations. We did work with the families of the victims, and we had the opportunity to listen to their side, but we understood that where we are with brain development during that time and some of the behavioral health issues. And so we made decisions that it was appropriate to have these gentlemen released. And those are just some of the things. So as State's Attorney, based on this conversation, we know that Montgomery County could be doing so much more. The State's Attorney's Office could be doing so much more than what they are doing. And I think as leader of that office, it would be incumbent upon me to bring these programs to Montgomery County. It is just not evolved at the appropriate pace. So Juvenile Lifers program, we also led the issue of strangulation. When Ms. Braveboy came into office, strangulation was a misdemeanor offense. It was second-degree assault. But now through our efforts, the law has changed, and strangulation is now a first-degree assault. We were one of 14 states that did not have strangulation as a first-degree assault. And so obviously that comes to play when related to domestic violence cases. And there's also had to be some training of nurses, training of certain things to, look for as it relates to bruising. There's also medical technology to see some of the internal bruising that can go on to help to make our case. But that goes to our commitment to protecting victims of domestic violence. So what you've heard here from all of the candidates is proof positive. Montgomery County is not evolving at the appropriate pace. And I believe that, you look at their, we run about a $19 million budget. They're at about $18 million budget. They have about 153 full-time employees, full-time equivalents. We have about 180. So the offices are close. And since like I said, I am in management now of a staff of attorneys and paraprofessionals. It just makes me a good fit to come in and bring my leadership skills to Montgomery County. And I believe that I can move the office forward.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Ms. McCoo-North, Mr. Degonia, a response to that in regards to moving the office forward in Montgomery County. Any response you want to share? Ms. McCoo-North.
One thing I would add is that I think we need to even not just talk about diversion programs, but really look at the point of deciding what to charge, whether to charge at all or to divert the individual to the appropriate programs that are already in the community. A lot of what we kind of touched on tonight is entry into the criminal justice system and the ramifications of that. But I believe as the next Madam State's Attorney, when I'm elected, we have to talk about why are we even getting individuals into system in the first place? Is that really necessary? And that involves a more robust screening unit to deal with the root causes of the crime, the alleged crime, and whether prosecution is worth our taxpayer dollars to do so, or whether it's better just to divert them to, like I said, a community program already in place. So we're talking about, Perry talked about evolving justice. It's not just let's just see what's been done, but how are we getting to, why are we getting the individuals into system in the first place? It's not so much diverting them out of jail, but diverting them out of the system to begin with.
Nice. Thank you. Mr. Degonia.
I think we probably all three agreed that change needs to happen or else we wouldn't be running. So when we're talking about the diversion and the pace, two things on that. One, the ability to set better policies and better priorities with the police officers who are actually making the arrest comes from direct intervention by the prosecutors at the stations. And that's really what I'm talking about. So I think Bernice and I agree on the fact that we can keep more people out of the system. And I'd also agree with Perry that there are ways, and at least in Montgomery County, one of the ways from a very technical standpoint is at central processing. I'm going to station a state's attorney at central processing so that if police arrest someone that we've determined is not someone who needs to be in the system, say this person is someone who's homeless, who has a mental health issue, and he's going to be locked up and he's going to spend the 30 days in jail because he doesn't have a place to live, we're going to have somebody in the central processing unit who can divert that case at that point before going in. And so I think it's critical that, one, we're setting those priorities, but those priorities are being conveyed to law enforcement who's out there on the street enforcing it. But then, two, if it gets past that, we've got somebody at central processing who can, in conjunction with our partners, and I've got a lot of experience working with our partners in Montgomery County. Family Justice Center was a model. We went in, this was under the sheriff's lead as the lead agency. We partnered with Health and Human Services. We partnered with our domestic violence survivors, nonprofits, and we really built a coalition. And it was a model, and I think it was adopted in Prince George's County as well, of how we address victims of domestic violence and survivors. And that's a project I've been working on for the last 12 years as the leader of the foundation. So I've got a lot of experience of working with our partners, setting better priorities that involve people from the bench, that involve law enforcement, all the partners who are going to be playing a role in setting better priorities about who we're detaining and who we're not detaining, more importantly, moving forward. So I've got a proven track record of working with those partners, but I also have some real solutions on how we keep people out of the system and divert them at critical points.
Sir, Mr. Paler, any rebuttal from the response that you've heard today regarding, the changing of and the justice that you want to see in your state attorney's office?
Well, and I just want to, I'm always watching the time. I just want to make sure that, there's other progressive things like cash bail. Obviously, my attorneys will know as soon as I'm sworn in, we will no longer request cash bail. And we have to look at the times that we're living in right now in Montgomery County, and this is a rough estimation. Based on COVID, I would say that there's over 1,000 cases in the queue that haven't been to trial because of the COVID closures. So we have a backlog of cases that must be dealt with. And so these people are already in the system, and it's going to take leadership and collaboration to get through that. And I believe having expanded diversion programs that we can offer to those that currently have charges will help us to work through the backlog. We know that now the public defender's office is more and more filing speedy trial motions based on the backlog. And so they need to be dealt with. And right now in Montgomery County, maybe you can do 2 to 3 jury trials a day. And then because of the jury selection process, it's really going to be a 2-day situation. You're talking about 2 or 3 trials with over 1,000 case backlog. So we need vision. We need experience, with diversion programs. And I believe that model is going to help us, work to resolve that backlog where people can be made accountable, but also they can, like I said, we can get the justice we need, keep people safe, and provide positive outcomes and move these people out of the system. Because we have people that have been charged since 2019, cases up hanging over their head, and they can't get to court. But diversion programs offer a resolution to both parties. And I think we need that, my vision and my leadership to kind of work on that backlog.
Thank you, Mr. Paler. Any other comment before we go into our final remarks?
Thank you.
Today has been thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am. It's been incredible in regards to the content that we focused on and the pivotal role that the person who's elected for this position is going to play. We've talked about experience. We've talked about enforcement. We've talked about expungement of marijuana charges. We've gone into, again, how should the department be focused? How do you achieve justice? So many things that we've talked about today that are critical. This is your time now, and we're going to start with Ms. McCurd-North in regards to what do you see, your vision, your final remarks in regards to why you would make the perfect person for this role for Montgomery County State Attorney's position in 2022. So we'll begin, Ms. McCurd-North, your thoughts.
Yes. Well, one of the reasons why I am running for state's attorney is that as co-chair of our Reimagining Policy Task Force, I noticed the true disconnect between the status quo and what the community was looking for. And I believe that it was time for transformative change in that office to reflect the needs of the community. I have the leadership experience and the transformative ideas to really take that office to the next level and to really match what the community is looking for in terms of making sure everyone feels safe, regardless of zip code, ethnic background, or income. When I was a prosecutor, a young prosecutor, I remember going through the decriminalization of marijuana phase. I remember prosecuting hardcore prosecuted marijuana cases, and then suddenly, paraphernalia was the only thing on the table. So I definitely have had the experience of dealing with reform as a line prosecutor, and as a community leader, I've fought for reform. Even as a line prosecutor, more than 10 years ago, we had legislation that was considered pretty harsh on young people, and that was a youth curfew. And I worked with different stakeholders across the community of Silver Spring, where I'm originally from, in Montgomery County. And we created recommendations that were diverting kids out of the system and into the programs that they need. And that's the kind of mentality that I've always carried with me, and why I've been able to garner endorsements so early in the campaign is because those people have known me for almost 10 years, more than 10 years, because I've always been a leader on criminal justice issues. Now that I have decided to run for state's attorney in it's really a humbling experience because I get to have the opportunity to move forward on the various principles that I've always felt were the right things to do as a prosecutor, but wasn't traditionally proper, right? And that's why I didn't stay as a prosecutor for very long. I knew the system wasn't working for everybody. I was there when Trayvon Martin was killed. I was there when Tamir Rice was an issue. I really had a crisis of wondering, what am I really doing to keep people safe? Is it just processing these cases, or really promoting alternatives to incarceration and ways to make sure that communities feel whole again, feel safe? And so that's why I've had, I mentioned this earlier, but that's why I've been running on the 4 principles of, seeking greater transparency, focusing on alternatives to incarceration, assessing equity and treatment in the way we're prosecuting, as well as focusing on restoring and stabilizing communities. I think that's very critical, especially that we've been through this COVID pandemic crisis. We've known that when we don't have things in place, we don't have the right housing and the right food, there is an instability in our community. And when you have a criminal conviction or criminal past that you can't shake, that only adds to the stress, right? And so when you have a prosecutor leading at the realm, making sure you understand that, yes, keep our community safe, but we also know that it's also not safe to have unnecessarily convictions on one's record to hinder progress. That also doesn't make us safe. That's why there's an increase in violent crime in Montgomery County. And it's not just with strangers, it's people that know each other, neighbors, family members, roommates. These are the cases that happen because right now we're having a crisis in our community. Yes, we're culture diverse, and yes, we're more affluent than most counties, but we're having a hard time just dealing with the basic needs as a human being. And that's the kind of mentality that I want to see in our state's attorney. And I believe I have the experience and the mindset to focus on that. I've also led several groups across the county and the region. And as a solo practitioner myself, I understand the business of law and focusing on budgets and make sure the budgets reflect the principles of the office and of the community's needs, the community's needs. And right now, our budget doesn't reflect that. It has to be a situation where we're talking about transforming the way we look at public safety, not just on punishment, not just the efficiency on making sure someone's punished, the efficiency on making sure we have someone who is getting out of the system, re-entering in a productive manner, and not falling back into recidivism patterns. Those are some of the things that I have thought a lot about, and I don't take this position lightly. I know if when I would be elected Massachusetts attorney, I would be a first of many on many levels, and that is why this matters so much to me, because I see so many people in the community very excited about the prospect of someone who has a fresh perspective of what justice looks like. I talked about the new prescription metaphor because I really believe that it really does take just a new way of looking at it. And once we get that in place, people will see justice for what it really is. Not so much on punishment, but on preparing our communities for more opportunities, better opportunities, because that's really the key to public safety, not just locking people up, making sure we deal with the root cause of the problem and making sure that we have the resources in place, assisted with the state attorney's office, to make sure that everyone feels safe regardless of who they are and where they come from. So thank you again for this opportunity. Again, I've repeated that before, but I appreciate the time to have this conversation with you all today. And thank you to Perry and Tom as well for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. McCoo-North. Thank you. We appreciate having you here today. Mr. Paylor, you're next. Yes, sir. Your final remarks regarding why you would be the perfect candidate for this position.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And I'm going to tell you the truth. If you had asked me a year ago, would I be running for state attorney for Montgomery County, I'm going to tell you that was the farthest thing from my mind. I had some health issues, and my wife had just donated her kidney to me in July of 2020. She's looking at me like, get the date right. She donated her kidney to me. I was in recovery, and everything was going well. I serve as deputy state's attorney in the most progressive state's attorney's office in the county. I have a great boss, Aisha Braveboy, and I was completely comfortable. But more and more, Miss Braveboy was being invited to Montgomery County, and she would come and stick her head in my office or call me, and she would say, you're Montgomery County folks. They're not, as she always says, that you're Montgomery County folks. They're not happy with what's going on. Your Montgomery County folks want to know why all the things that are going on in our office, the diversion programs, the leadership in Annapolis, how come Montgomery County State Attorney's Office is not leading in those efforts? And it kind of dawned on me that who's best? Who would be the best person to bring those reforms to Montgomery County? And I wrestled with it. Really, I didn't want to do it. My wife and I, we did a vote. Me and her, we sat down, and the vote came back 50-50. I said yes, she said no. And so I was like, well, we're stuck. But when your wife gives you a kidney, it's more than just skin in the game, right? We had to really talk about it. But I kept going back to this Dr. King quote, and the hottest places in hell are reserved for those who remain neutral in times of moral crisis. So I had to really take a look at myself. Do I just stay as a deputy in Prince George's County and just have a great life, go to work every day, and where I agree with everything and all the citizens agree with Ms. Braveboard, or do I take on the enormous challenge of changing the state's attorney's office in Montgomery County? And trust me, I was up at night tossing and turning and trying to figure out, what is it? Why can't I get this rock out of my shoe? And really, because clearly I know that I am the best person to lead that office, and I couldn't avoid it. I've talked a lot about my role as deputy, but I was in private practice for 15 years. I did criminal defense. And like I said, I really had some issues with the way some of the cases were handled. And I know it comes from the top down, that the prosecutors were comfortable, little things like driving on suspended license. If you get your license fixed and you have a lawyer, the case should be dismissed in Montgomery County. All of us on the call know that's the practice. But if you go up there without an attorney, sometimes they would try to be slippery and say, oh, you got to pay $100 fine or plead guilty, even if the license is repaired. Those little microaggressions were an indication of a larger problem within the office. We talk about police reform, and I know there's been different panels and different reports, but not only did I do criminal defense, I've actually sued police departments. I've sued for wrongful death and excessive force. So I'm intimately familiar with the use of force. We had the opportunity as the office to be a part of the police reform legislation. And, when you're talking about prosecuting, changing police reform, we've talked about conviction and sentencing integrity units, but our office also maintains a robust public integrity unit. In our first year in office, we prosecuted 12 police officers. A distinct difference I had with the current state's attorney's office is when it relates to fatalities, this office, Montgomery County, sends their cases to Howard County for that state's attorney to handle the case. They have a reciprocal agreement. Quite candidly, on day one, that agreement, we will terminate that. I will start a public integrity unit, and we will investigate and handle the cases in-house. Now, I know with the new law, the Attorney General's office has the internal investigation unit that they investigate police fatalities, and they put together a case, and they actually took our chief from Prince George's County and made that person the deputy. So and the deputy investigator, the principal investigator, came from Prince George's County. So I'm very intimately familiar with that unit, but it's still incumbent on the local prosecutor to decide to prosecute the case and move forward. And I'm gonna tell you that when elected, the residents and the police will be looking to me for justice, and I'm not going to be hiding behind another state's attorney up the road that no one in Montgomery County voted for, right? And so I believe I have the experience to manage the office. Our budgets are about the same, about a little below 20 million. We actually have more full-time equivalents in Prince George's County. So I just felt like my background, my experience makes me the candidate. And like I've always said, justice is evolving, and is not evolving in appropriate pace in Montgomery County. And I believe we all deserve justice in Montgomery County, all of our youth, regardless of zip code. We know there's a difference between what happens on the south and the east side of the county versus the north and the west. And we know what's going on with our youthful offenders. There is a movement in our country. We know with the brain science, right, that young people don't fully mature until age 26. And in my administration, our practices and our policies will match the science, and I will keep youthful offenders in juvenile court. And I think that, when you look at my qualifications and my background, deputy is a big thing I talk about, but also my time in private practice, that makes me the ideal candidate, makes me the best person to run that office on day one. And I just want to thank everyone for giving me the opportunity to join you this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Paylor. And last but not least, Mr. DeGonia, you have 5 minutes to share your position on why you would be the best person for this position. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. McCarthy, and thank you for being such a wonderful moderator today. I think we're a pretty civil panel, and I want to say
You are.
thank you to Mr. Paler as well as Ms. Mirku North as well. We do see each other a lot, whether it's on this panel or it's out on the campaign trail. So I appreciate that. And I appreciate the Cannabis Patient Advocacy Association for hosting this today and the discussion on marijuana use and legalization. It sounds like we all have a lot to say about other things as well, but certainly that topic plays a critical role in how we are reforming how I'm going to look at criminal justice in a different way. And we do have real problems in Montgomery County. Over the last 6 years, 88% of the children who came through the juvenile justice system were children of color. 99% of the kids who were charged as adults in Montgomery County were children of color. They still hold people on cash bond in Montgomery County. 70% of the, approximately 70% of the people who are detained are people of color. We've got more than 30 homicides on the books so far this year. And over the last 3 years, we've seen a tremendous growth in ghost guns. In 2019, there were 9. In 20, there were 38. And to date, so far this year, and we're not even to the end of the year just yet, over 46 ghost guns have been taken off the streets. It's not a transparent system. If you don't have a transparent system, you can't have justice. And I can tell you that because I've been through all the aspects of this system. I was a prosecutor here for 8 years. I led a felony trial team. I've been in private practice. I've prosecuted other prosecutors. I've been called back into service on the Eastern Shore. I've been a prosecutor, special prosecutor in Prince George's County, dealing with one of the largest child exploitation cases in county history while I was in private practice. I also served on a federal consent decree monitoring team for the city of Detroit, where they were under a consent decree. Their police force was. We went in and we had to monitor the actual implementation of change. So not only do I have that experience, I had the real experience of working here in Montgomery County for the last 12 years as the president of the Family Justice Center Foundation. We've raised millions of dollars. We've served tens of thousands of people, victims and their families. A system that we built from the ground up here in Montgomery County. So I have that leadership ability. I also have the ability to be an agent of change. When I was the president of the Bar Association, and I talked about this earlier, the Racial Justice Council, it's a difficult topic. It's a topic that we must address. We've got to own that. We've got a lack of leadership right now who says it's going to take us 2 years and a study to tell us if there's a problem. I don't need a study. I don't need 2 years. Change has to happen now. I can tell you it's there. I go to the juvenile detention center and I represent my clients. I can tell you who the kids are who are there. You go to the adult detention center, you go to the jail. I can tell you who's there. I don't need a study to tell me that. So we need that leadership, and that's leadership that I've demonstrated through my leadership in the Bar Association, through my leadership at the Family Justice Center. These are not intractable problems, but we have to be willing to work together to solve them. And we have to be willing to hold our police accountable. And how do we do that? My solution is I'm going to put my prosecutors out in the stations. They're going to be there working with the community, but they're also going to be serving as a level of oversight. And this is something we haven't really talked about, is something that a lot of people don't know is police officers have body-worn cameras, but really the prosecutors are the only ones who can see all of that footage. We're going to be required to look at that footage. The legislature had the foresight to say state's attorneys are going to have to look at no-knock warrants. They're going to be required to look at them. Now, I'm going to tell my prosecutors, I want you looking at all those warrants. I want you to review those because I want to make sure, one, that we're doing the right thing, and two, we're thinking strategically about how we're conducting investigations. We're putting priorities on violent crime. We're putting a priority on getting ghost guns off the street. We're deprioritizing cases that penalize people for being poor, for being homeless, for having a mental health problem, or a drug dependency. And I talked a little bit earlier about how we're going to divert folks out of the system. But that's one of the things about putting prosecutors in the community is they're going to know the resources. I worked with, when I was in the state's attorney's office and when I was a prosecutor, I partnered with the Bethesda Urban Partnership. There was an increase in people who were homeless, who were accosting people as they were coming out of their business offices during the day. And what did we do? How did I solve that problem? I went to Bethesda Cares and I said, listen, if I can convince these businesses to make a donation, will you give individuals who make a donation a card that they can then give to someone who they'll feel good about making a donation to an organization that's going to serve and going to meet the needs. And that person is now going to have the information where they can go and get the services. They can get food, they can get shelter. So we're actually solving the problem without engaging the police at all. And that's the type of problem solving and leadership of problem solving that I'm going to bring to the office. And that's what we have to do, is looking at how we're going to solve these problems and make everyone safer, whether you're in Bethesda or Burtonsville, Poolsville or Potomac, Damascus or downtown Silver Spring or Tacoma Park. I want everybody to be safe. And we've got to make that a affirmative effort. It's not about sentences, it's about safety. It's not about case processing, it's about problem solving.
Thank you so much, Mr. DeGonia. I appreciate your comments as well. We have now concluded our debate. This was the Montgomery County State Attorney's 2022 candidate debate. There were so many different items, and we really started with the marijuana convictions and the fact of medical cannabis and how those arrests are affecting our community. Everyone did such a great job. Some of the takeaway items that I walked away with and listening to, and I'm not going to tag them to any individual person, but especially with my role as the CEO of Minorities for Medical Marijuana, we just want to make sure communities of color are no longer targeted and that they are having the opportunity to make sure that they have fair game in this new budding industry. And so I'd love to eliminate the price of prosecuting possession cases. Again, looking at ways that we can support legalizations that we know we need to decrease the number of Blacks that disproportionately are affected. Policy regarding sharing and consuming. It sounded like that was something that came up in the conversation. When it comes to expungement, even the 5-year look back, that window should be greater, should be expanded. And I think that was a great point that was shared with all. The economic opportunities that this industry is going to give to the constituents that live in Montgomery County. It needs to be fair. It needs to be open. I think there was conversation again on entrepreneurship training. Distinguishing distribution is equal throughout Montgomery County when it comes to licensing. So many different areas that we talked about: public safety, quality of product, education, accountability, community involvement. And of course, every candidate got a chance to share from their perspective why they would be the best person for the job. So again, we thank you. We thank you. We thank the Cannabis Patient Advocacy Association for your intention. Intention matters. Intentionality is so important for putting on this debate this afternoon. And a special thank you to Marian Main. Marian Main is a Black-owned, woman-owned dispensary regulator, operator in the state of Maryland, who really steps up to the plate every single time and not only brings the best quality medical cannabis to patients in Maryland, but they are truly in the community, educating, providing resources, making sure that we're informed. And we cannot say thank you enough. So one thing I want to make sure that we take care of before we get out of here is voting and registration. All this stuff is in vain. If we don't get engaged, if we don't get out and vote, it does not matter, right? So voting and registration primary, June 28th, 2022. Mark this down, June 28th, 2022. June 7th, voter registration deadline or in person on day of. The general election will be on November 8th, 2022. October 18th, voter registration deadline or in person on day of. So make sure that you get registered, make sure you vote, take a friend to the poll, get out and vote. We thank you guys so much for your participation today, and I'm going to kick this over to Rita Montoya as she closes out the summit. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, Roz. Many thanks to all of our moderators, speakers, and candidate participants for their time and presence today. The Cannabis Patient Advocacy Association also gives many special thanks to those working hard behind the scenes to make this summit a reality, including our digital tech producer, Rob Black, our law student intern, Kennedy Phillips from New England Law, Marion Main, as well as the entire board of the Cannabis Patient Advocacy Association. Most importantly, we would like to take a special moment to thank and acknowledge the indigenous peoples upon whose ancestral lands all of our work takes place, the African peoples forced to toil this land, and the indigenous and Black communities living in Maryland today. We offer our respect and gratitude to the indigenous and Black peoples, past, present, and future, whose custodial responsibility we all benefit from. Change can only occur when we use our voice to speak truth to power. Thank you for tuning in to the 2021 Cannabis Policy Summit, hosted by the Cannabis Patient Advocacy Association. We ask that you please remember to use your voice. Thank you.